Dr. Sudarshan had some difficulty with joining. Therefore, there was he was not able to copy the link from the WhatsApp into the thing. That was okay. Now he's got the link, I think. We'll start. Okay. Okay. Good afternoon to all of you. As I'm once more requesting all the participants other than the speakers to keep your mic on mute mode as well as the camera off, and only when any of the speakers ask for a response you can unmute and speak, need not open the camera. Yeah. Anyway, now we are sorry for a slight delay in starting of this program. Our whole intention of this particular webinar is to bring a little bit of a clarity into what is risk and how the risk is, managed, assessed, dealt and managed and communicated in the food safety regulation. And this webinar has been purely, intended to the students who are either studying any of the courses on food sciences, food science and technology, food science and nutrition, food engineering, or any of the allied food science courses, or any other students who are interested in food safety. And this actually started. Good afternoon, Dr. Sudarshan. Yeah, he's chanting. Therefore, me and Dr. Louis were discussing a couple of months back, and why not we have a series of webinars where we can bring clarity into the understanding of what are the food safety issues which needs clarity from the point of view of academics, and highest importance in that sense would go into understanding what are the risks associated with food and how these risks are perceived, understood, perceived, assessed, and managed and communicated. This is a series of steps involved in how risk is dealt in food safety. Therefore, in doing this, we thought we will target the students and academicians involved in food science and food safety, so that we make them better understand this particular aspect, so that they can tomorrow in the coming years, when they become independent scientists, can participate in this endeavor of ensuring food safety. Now, it is always said eating food is a risky business. Therefore, when you put something into your mouth, that gets into a digestive tract, gets digested and gets absorbed. There is no selectivity shown there. You must be knowing any of the chemical substances, starting from salt all the way to poisons. Any of these, if they are bioactive substances, they will go get absorbed and create various kinds of biological activity, including toxicity or some long-term effects such as carcinogenic activity, teratogenic activity, and so on and so forth. Therefore, when we are talking about these food-related risks, I think the starting point is home. Because traditionally, if you go back, 100 years or even, in the last century, if you have been going through, most of the people used to cook at home and eat. Then when somebody cooks at home and eats, after every cooking or after every, instance of handling the food, it is limited to 4, 5 or a few people. And as this scale becomes bigger and bigger, that means you are talking about you are eating food or you are buying food where you don't know, you are not seeing face to face the person who is processing or cooking or serving it to you. Then you have to trust whatever the product he has given to you. When you are trusting him, on what basis you are trusting? There should be a scale, or there should be a way which makes you trust somebody. Therefore, in today's modern, times, when you are talking about trusting somebody, you are trusting him through somebody. That somebody is the food safety regulator. Therefore, the food safety regulator regulates the food, and certain markings or certain markings, numbers or seals or certificates are given. Those makes you believe that the whatever you are consuming is safe. That means somebody is identifying the risks, assesses that, then manages it and communicates to you that yes, we are managing the risk, so that your exposure to that particular risk is to the minimum or as low as reasonably achievable. And even if there is any pertinent risk to you, which might also get communicated to you, saying that yes, this particular food contains this. If you are belonging to a category where you might be having a problem, you may not be eating this. Therefore, with this background, I would just try to take this forward. And now we have three speakers today to speak on this. One is Professor Dr. Joseph Lewis. I think he is very well known, at least in our university environment. And as we have various students and scholars and faculty from various universities who are outside, Professor Lewis, you can say hello.
Hi.
Yeah. Dr. Lewis is from Mumbai Mahanagari, and he has been he had a rich experience of working with the industry, and he is one of those people who are from the industry with a very strong academic mindset. That is also because he started his career as a teacher at the UDCT. Then he had been to UK. And after finishing his PhD, he joined Britannia, and he worked for a very long time in Marico, and retired from Marico. And after superannuating from Marico, he has been actively involved in the with the food safety regulation with the FSSAI at various capacities. And because of all these mixed experiences Professor Dr. Lewis has, he is one of those people who can communicate quite well on the whole concept of various issues relating to food safety. And one more aspect which I would like to make a special mention about Dr. Lewis is that Dr. Lewis has been associated with us for the last 10 years, and he was also visiting professor for a very short time of 2 years. And other than that, he has been teaching our students in our university as well as in UDCT, that is ICT Mumbai, and various colleges of Mumbai. Therefore, he has been sharing his rich experience with the young students. He always used to tell us that it's the youngsters who need to be clear on what they are studying first, so that they can make further developments in the subject. And first speaker will be Dr. Lewis, who will be talking on the what is risk, to make. And the speaker of today is Dr. R.V. Sudarshan. He is also Dr. Sudarshan. You can say hello, Dr. Sudarshan. Second speaker is Dr. Sudarshan, who is Deputy Director, retired from ICMR National Institute of Nutrition, Hyderabad. Sudarshan, say hello to.
Yeah, hello.
Yeah.
Is it audible
yes.
now?
Yeah. Very well.
Yeah.
And Dr. Sudarshan and me were colleagues in National Institute of Nutrition, Hyderabad during my PhD days. And Dr. Sudarshan is one more person who has a very strong academic mindset and a very good communicator. And Dr. Sudarshan, has worked for a couple of decades in National Institute of Nutrition. And during his tenure at National Institute of Nutrition, Hyderabad, in the Food and Drug Toxicology Research Center, he has worked extensively with various aspects of food safety, especially his contribution to the food adulteration, understanding the food adulteration and the management is well commended, throughout the country. And what we always appreciate is the depth of understanding and practical understanding of the food safety issues of Dr. Sudarshan, and how he puts the matter in the right perspective and communicates to the either to the regulator or to the public in general is very well appreciated. And we have Dr. Sudarshan also is has been actively involved in various capacities at the Food Safety Standards Authority of India, and I also welcome Dr. Sudarshan. And Dr. Sudarshan will be the second speaker. He is going to discuss with you on how the food safety is assessed and managed, because the most important part is once you know what is the risk, once you perceive the risk, and what is important is how do you manage it. Therefore, risk assessment and management. And we have the third speaker with us, Dr. SubbaRao. Dr. SubbaRao. Dr. SubbaRao is also a senior scientist at the National Institute. Dr. SubbaRao?
Yes, I'm here. Hello. Namaste.
Yeah, you can. Hello. Yeah. Dr. SubbaRao is also from National Institute of Nutrition, and he is currently working there. And Dr. SubbaRao is a very well-known, science communicator, as well as an active scientist working in the area of food safety. And Dr. SubbaRao also is actively involved in the various the regulatory bodies of India at the capacity as an advice, in terms of his scientific advice to FSSAI, ICMR, and other organizations. And Dr. SubbaRao is also, the well known for his way of scientific communications, as well as how he puts across the very complex issues in a very simple fashion. Anyway, he is also a trained, communicator. Welcome, Dr. SubbaRao, for today's session. And Dr. SubbaRao will be talking to you on how to communicate the risk, because this is the most important one, because you might be doing the most complex scientific analysis. Unless and otherwise, these complex scientific analysis is properly communicated to the public in the simplest of the way, the whole exercise will be of no use. Therefore, Dr. SubbaRao will be the third speaker. And what I would suggest is that all the three speakers will first speak, and at the end we'll have all three of them on board. And some of the people who are online now here can pose them questions one by one during that interaction session. And we will also be taking some of the questions which are sent by chat mode from the YouTube streaming, which will be noted and asked. Therefore, we can spend maybe around 20 minutes at the end for this question answer as well as discussion. Is it okay?
Yes.
Yeah. And again, yeah, Dr. SubbaRao. Dr. SubbaRao, you are muted, I think.
I was just saying, okay.
Okay.
Fine. I could hear you. Okay. Now, again, one more time, because some people have joined latest. All the audience, please keep your mic muted as well as camera off. Only as and when the speakers ask you for some response, then only you can unmute your mic and still keep the camera off. Professor Luis, now you can go ahead with your presentation. Thank you.
Okay. Can you see the screen?
Not yet, Doc. Not yet.
Oh, not yet. Okay. So, do I have presentation rights?
Yes, you do. You from the bottom right, you can say present.
Okay.
No, we have it. We have it. Yes, Doc. Now it's coming.
Okay.
Yeah, you can. Yes.
So everyone can see the screen now?
Yes.
All right. So once again, good afternoon to all of you. And thank you, Dr. Shetty, for giving me one of the best introductions I've ever had. And also your promotion to being professor, which hopefully I should achieve in this lifetime. And the second one is that I think the point that Dr. Shetty made is that to me, speaking to students is almost the best thing that I would like to do. And to convey to students basically the opportunity that you have to build concepts, especially at a time where there is so much of media information that you can get on the Google or elsewhere. So in your formative years, the most important thing is for you is to get the right information and get it from the right source. So universities and academia are really the right source for information, particularly to sciences. Now, let me tell you what I am going to do. I am not getting into the science of risk analysis. Following this presentation, there's Dr. Sudarshan and Dr. SubbaRao who will convey to you the sciences of risk analysis. What I am actually going to do now is to talk to you about the method of risk analysis. Very often when we hear these words, the words sometimes convey a meaning much larger than what they really mean. And we sometimes get a little bit nervous on what these words mean. Are they too big for us to follow? One way of breaking down the myth of big words or what sounds very lofty and high and difficult to understand is to break it down into small little bits and pieces. And basically that's what I'm trying with you now today. How do we build this concept of risk analysis? And I don't want to get into the foods area because all of y'all, if y'all come from foods, I know we all eat food, so in some way or the other, we are connected with food. Often all the preconceived ideas that we have regarding food might interfere with our understanding. So the best way to learn without any interference or preformed ideas that you and I may have, it's to approach a concept through a cognitive learning approach. Now, I will try to explain to you in the first slide itself, what is it that we are going to do and what do I mean by a cognitive approach. So, you might have heard this expression, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And basically that's what this presentation is all about. So, this is learning by looking at images. Images and pictures are very powerful communicators. They evoke a lot of feelings in us. By seeing a picture, you can get the evocation of fear, of liking something, or something looking cute, as we say. Very often when we look at a photograph of ourselves at a very tender age, we will say, oh, how cute he looks. But that imagery conveys a certain feeling. And basically these feelings never leave you for an entire lifetime. So one way of learning is to look at a picture. The picture will evoke a certain reaction within you, and that reaction will stay with you for the rest of your life, most likely. So we will use these images to help us understand what is risk analysis. The teaching by using an image or imagery is far more powerful than verbal descriptions. If I were to tell you all this about risk assessment or risk analysis by a lot of text, you are unlikely to remember the text. You will read it now. You will feel for the moment that you have understood what I'm saying. But when you leave this webinar and tomorrow, you might find it very difficult to recall what we learned yesterday. So by looking at these pictures, you will be able to memorize it. It will stay in your mind and perhaps it will stay forever. That is the intent of this session. Now, during the session, because there are going to be a lot of pictures, I am hoping that you will interact, because I will ask you a question as to what is the image signifying to you. So I would like you to convey very quickly as to what it signifies and answer the question in the best way possible. I do not need explanations. I do not need your reasoning. All you have to do is to answer the question yes or no, or if there is a choice being given to you, then you have to only opt for, it might be choose A, B, or C. So all you need to do is to only opt for A, B, or C. So remember, there are no explanations. We do not want your reasoning. We only want you to interact very quickly. Typically, what comes top of your mind is the reaction that we would like to capture. Because as I said, the picture is supposed to evoke a feeling within you, and that feeling within you, you'll have to communicate. Before we get into this picture and images session, there are one or two things that I would like you to remember. The first question is, why are we doing risk analysis? I mean, all of you all can ask why, what was the need for Dr. Shetty to start this food science series? If all of you all are in academics and if all of you all are in school, in foods, you will find this helpful. For those who are even not involved in foods, not involved in science, risk analysis is a method applicable everywhere. Perhaps unconsciously, you do risk analysis almost every day. I mean, if you cross the road, what are you doing? You look right or left to see whether the traffic is coming or a car is approaching. You calculate actually how quick the car will reach you when you're crossing the road. And based on this assessment, you will decide to cross the road or wait for the vehicle to pass and then cross the road. What have you done in a split second or in a few seconds? You have done a risk assessment. So risk assessment, risk analysis, etc. are methods. Very often some of these methods are already instilled in us in certain life situations. Like I gave you the example of crossing the road. Similarly, the same analysis, the same methodology is being used in food regulatory systems. And modern food regulatory systems are based on science. And the science that is being used in food regulatory systems is best based on risk analysis. So in other words, we can say the modern food regulatory systems are risk-based. Now, as you know, our own regulation, the Indian regulation of 2006, is a risk-based regulation, which is very different from the regulatory, the adulteration regulation of the old, that is the PFA. So the risk-based regulation has now replaced the food adulteration regulation. It does not mean that there is no food adulteration now, but food adulteration is only a part of the regulation. It is not the whole as it was before. So under a risk-based regulation, you will also deal with instances of adulteration. Remember, adulteration is an instance of making the food unsafe or making it of a quality that is not good enough to be consumed. So first thing to remember, all modern food systems are science-based. Because most of these countries like Codex, US FDA, EU, Australia, New Zealand, because their regulations too are based on science or risk framework, it means, therefore, the standards that come out from different countries are always harmonized. Why do they need to be harmonized? So that there is free trade across the world. So remember what I'm saying. I am saying the processes are harmonized. I am not saying that the standards or the limits are harmonized. You have to arrive at the standards or limits, which I think Dr. Rao will explain to you in the next session. These are the limits you arrive is typical of the country in which you live and the populations, the consumption patterns, the exposure. So these are processes that help you to arrive at the maximum levels that are existing in standards. The third important thing of risk analysis or risk-based regulations is that it involves the entire chain, the entire food chain, unlike the previous regulation, which only looked at the packaged foods. That means the food had to be packed, put in the market, and then it would be inspected. Now it's the entire chain. That means it starts from production to consumption. And each and every, as we call them, the food business operators, each and every person in that chain who deals with that food, either by processing, by sale, distributing, transporting, all of them are responsible for the safety of the food. Obviously, you know, as the expression goes, the strength of the chain depends on its weakest link. So right through the chain, therefore, today the oversight of safe food revolves on the chain, and to figure out at which point in the chain would you find the weakest link. Is it in production? Is it in processing? Is it in storage? Is it in transporting? Or even is it at the retail shelf because he has not stored the food in a proper condition? So you can see the whole chain is involved. But the most important thing or the greatest advantage of a risk-based system is that risk-based controls are a predictive system. It can tell you way in advance whether there is going to be a likelihood of an unsafe event. Unlike, again, the previous system, which was a reactive system, inspection would involve picking up the sample from the market, the food package from the market, send it to a laboratory, get it tested, and based on the test results, then you would prosecute the food business operator who had put that package in the market. But remember, he has only picked up one sample or one package of a batch, might send about thousands or even 1 million such packages. So the system relied on one package being tested for safety, which you and I can understand that it is not a very stable or a confident system. So you can see, therefore, this concept of risk analysis is not just limited to a product to find out whether a product is safe or unsafe. Risk analysis is a method that applies even to processes. The entire chain is a process. So if you apply it to the entire chain, you will assess risks at each and every point on the chain. You will determine which is the weakest part in the chain, and then you will know, you will be able to predict that if a failure happens in food safety, where this failure will happen, at which point it will happen. So you can see, therefore, there is an overall protection of the population when you have such a system. So it's a good thing that we have such a system with us. Two or three things I would like you to remember as we go along. Some of these are definitions, but let me take the definition of hazard. Very often we make a mistake between hazard and risk. Hazard very clearly is a biological, chemical, or physical agent. I would like you to remember this word agent. It will come up in the picture session that we will have just later on. So remember the word agent. Remember the word or condition. These two things represent hazards, agent or a condition of food. The agent must have a potential. The agent must have a potential to cause an adverse effect. So there are three parts: an agent or condition. Potential is the third part, and the second part, and this is the third one, it must be capable of an adverse effect. This is the definition of a hazard. When you come to risk, it's a different kind of a definition. It's a probability of an adverse effect. This causes the adverse effect, and this is the probability that the adverse effect will happen. And the second part of it is the severity of that adverse effect. Is the adverse effect low, medium, high, fatal? So this is the severity. And the likelihood of that it will happen is the probability. And these two things will happen as a consequence of a hazard. That means you must know the hazard that is responsible for this effect, the risk, the effect that has taken place, or its severity. So you cannot talk about risk in a general term. It has to be a very specific to a hazard when you're talking about a risk. So let's look at what are the three parts of risk analysis. And you will, as you've seen, Dr. SubbaRao as well as Dr. Sudarshan will be covering some parts, perhaps similar. And so what I will do is I will just take you through these two parts, the risk assessment and the risk management. And I will I will take you through a session which does not really deal with food. The science of food is something that Dr. Sudarshan will deal with. What I am going to do with you is only to build the concept. We are building the concept from non-food situations. We are building the concept from pictures which have no relation to food. But these pictures are going to evoke a certain expression, mental expression of fear or friendliness, or I think something that I can touch, feel. I have no problem. I do not fear this thing. Some of them might provoke a sense of fear. So these are the things that we will do to help us to identify hazards. So let's take we'll go through this in very good detail. These are something which are management options, but we will just give you an idea as to what it means when you say I have alternatives. What is the meaning of alternatives? How do I select an appropriate option? So we'll just do this in a non-food situation. These are the 4 steps. And the other thing that I need to say to you, these two are not connected to each other. They may be related, but one does not do the other. So you can see you do the risk assessment first, then it goes on to the risk manager, and then of course it goes to the risk communicator. So they are separate. They may be interrelated, but they're separate, and you have different people doing these two functions. I'll just give you a kind of an example which happens in our daily life. Often when we fall ill, you are asked to go to the doctor. Often we go to a doctor. Most often the doctor is someone whom we call the family doctor. He's a doctor that our parents have been to him. He lives very close to the house or the village, and we know him on a first term basis. He recognizes us, we recognize him. So we go to the doctor and we tell him all the symptoms. I have this headache, fever. In these days, most of us are afraid even to go to doctors. But when we go to him and explain our problems to him, the symptoms, we explain to him the symptoms. What does he do? He sometimes asks you to get a diagnostic test done. It could be a blood test, it could be a urine test, it could be a stool test. He asks you to do that test. He doesn't do it himself, but he asks you to go to a diagnostic center. You go to the diagnostic center and they take a sample of your blood, urine, stool, whatever it is, and then they give you a report. If you look at that report, the doctor does not give any opinion, although the diagnostic center is under the supervision of a doctor, a medical professional. But they just give you a plain report. They tell you your blood sugar is between X and Y, and what are the limits for a diabetic condition and a non-diabetic condition. They tell you what is your blood cholesterol, and they give you the ranges again of low, high, medium cholesterol, etc. He does not tell you what is wrong with you. Now, what you do is you take your reports and go and see your family doctor again. The family doctor looks at the reports. He knows your history, your parental history, and then he tells you, sometimes he says, oh, there's nothing to worry. All I need you to take these 3 or 4 tablets 3 times a day. Avoid fatty foods or too much of salt, or reduce your sugar or whatever it is, exercise more, etc. And come and see me maybe in a month or so. What has the 2 individuals done? The diagnostic center where you went for your urine test has done a risk assessment. He has assessed your symptoms and found out where the hazards are lying, or where is it, how severe is this. He does not give you an opinion. He sends it to your doctor, your family doctor, who does risk management. He looks at your analytical reports. He knows the background history of your family. He knows where you work and professionally what are the kind of conditions that you undergo in your professional work. Based on that, he recommends to you a treatment. He asks you to come back as a follow-up. So this is a life kind of an example of risk assessment and risk management. These 2 people are not substitutable. That's the thing I want you to understand. They are not substitutable. They communicate to each other, but they do not do each other's work. Okay, so let's do step 1 of risk analysis, risk assessment. Step 1 of risk assessment is identify the hazard. So in this, now here is where I want you to interact quickly. I have a full screen, so I don't know really how much of your questions I will be able to see, but possibly if Dr. Shetty can help me out, or maybe you unmute and ask the question. So step 1, you can see this picture here, and there'll be 3 questions that will follow. So you just have to answer those questions as quickly as possible. Please remember, as I said earlier, I do not want explanations. I do not want your projections. We do not want any of your other comments. All we want you to do is observe this picture. Just observe it first, as well as possible. And then I will ask you the question, and the question is this: what will happen next? The answer has to be in 1 or 2 words. Okay, this open up to you? So you can either unmute and let me know your answer, or you can send it through the chat. So can I have your first answers? We're not going to take too much time. So if you can unmute quickly and let me know what will happen next. Is there anyone? Yes. Someone is unmuted. What will happen next? We have already spent 10 seconds.
Somebody in the chat is saying nothing. The next one is saying a fall is certain.
Someone says a fall is certain. Okay, let's take that answer. A fall is certain. The man will fall. Okay, now let's ask the second question. Why do you think the man will fall? What is the probability that the man will fall? Is there a high probability, low probability, or no probability that he will fall? Perhaps he will never fall. What is the probability that the man will fall? Remember, the word is probability. From observations. Anyone? Okay. Looking at the observations that all the leaves have fallen to the ground, not a single leaf on any of the trees there is on the ground, the probability of the man falling on the ground is high. Sorry, where is this? The probability of the man falling on the ground is high. Mind you, I use the word probability. I do not say he will definitely fall on the ground. So we are talking about, when we talk about risk, there's always a probability of high and low or no. But there is not enough of evidence from this observation to say that he will not fall on the ground. He will still remain there. Most of the probability points to the fact that he might be there. He might still continue. Okay, let's go. Yes. Okay. Okay. Okay.
Yes, Doc, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if you can hear me now, so we have finished this slide. So let's go to the next one. What I'm trying to tell you in this slide, the probability of the man that the man will fall is high. And this is high because from the observations that we made, all the leaves have fallen on the ground. Not a single leaf is on any of the trees. And therefore, the likelihood of the leaf falling down along with the man is high. But let's go to the next example now. This, I will show you three pictures here: A, B, and C. What I want you to do is three things. We said by definition a hazard is an agent. There is also or a condition, but in this case, I'm asking you to identify the agent. The agent must have a potential, and the potential is to cause harm or a adverse health effects. So let's use the word harm, which is very close to us. So I will show you three pictures. On each picture, you will have to identify the agent and tell me why he's the agent, because he either has to have the potential to cause harm. So let's take the first picture. Can you now identify the agent here? Can anyone unmute and tell me who's the agent? Is it difficult to unmute? Is it going to take
crocodile, sir? Is it crocodile?
Yes. Why are you saying crocodile? What does it have? Crocodile? Does it have the other two?
Yeah, sir. It has the quality to harm others.
It has the potential. You stick to this. Yeah. So the agent is the crocodile because it has the potential to cause harm. Okay. Very good. Let's go to the next one. So once again here, agent with the potential to cause harm. Now I'm making the identification a little bit more and more difficult. So this is the idea that you get your concepts right. Your concepts must be clear. So you will find the picture becoming more and more complicated, perhaps. It's not complicated. It is simple if you understand the picture. Yes. Someone said something? Yeah. Can I hear anyone? Who is the agent in this picture? Which is the agent here?
Human beings, sir. Lady.
Okay, that lady is not going to be very happy with your answer. Anybody else?
Alligators or crocodile?
Yes, the crocodile possibly. But is this crocodile alive or dead?
It's dead, sir. Dead.
It is dead. This is a museum where there is a crocodile. So, yes, there is an agent. Yes, there is an agent. It's the crocodile. Please do not say it's this lady over here. I think it's not the image that it invokes. So the crocodile is the agent. However, because it is a stuffed crocodile, it lacks the potential to cause harm. Is that clear?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So don't forget that the agent may be present. Even in food, an agent may be present, but it lacks the potential to cause harm. So please be very clear about agent and potential. Don't always look for something just because you see it there, and be very specific whether this thing will cause the harm, or as you are mentioning, the lady will cause. I don't see why the lady will cause you a harm, unless of course you have offended her. Okay, let's go to the third one. So can you now get me the three hazard identification? Identify the three points here. So who's the agent here?
Again, the crocodile, a small crocodile.
Yes, a small crocodile is the agent. Does it have the potential to cause harm?
Has less potential, maybe.
Very good. Excellent. Very good. So now if you see, in this case, it's a dead crocodile. So there is no agent. I mean, there is an agent, but it does not have the potential. So there is no hazard. This one has the potential to cause harm, but it is very, very low. Whereas in A, it is very high. So please be very clear when you do hazard identification. You must be specific on the agent. So it is the agent here, it is the agent here, it is the agent here. They are all three the same agent. However, what differs from all three is only one of them has a potential to cause harm, and the severity of that potential is very high. Whereas here too, there is a potential to cause harm, but the severity of the harm is very low. You will come across many of these cases of high and low when it comes to foods like pesticides, additives, etc. I think when Dr. Sudarshan will talk to you, he will give you such examples. I'll give you another case. Once again, I'm deliberately giving you pictures which look similar with a little bit of variation so that you are clear in your concepts. Do not try to stray from these three words: agent, potential, and cause harm. Do not try to think there is something beyond the picture. You have to work only on the picture, not on your preconceived notions or opinions or your, I think so, projections. So please keep away from that. Only observe the picture. So here there is a road. It's an empty road. So let me take you through this first. Do you see a hazard here? What is the hazard here? I mean, what is the agent here? Do not feel afraid to say there is no agent. Now, just because I put the picture and said, is there an agent? You might think there has to be one. Otherwise, why would I ask the question? Very often we are afraid to say no. So is there an agent here?
No,
Some people are saying no agents. Many people are saying no agents.
Okay, so there is no agent, and therefore if there is no agent, the following the following question, whether it has potential to cause harm, does not exist. So let's look at another one. So here it's a forest. And so what is the agent here? I'm complicating the picture, but this is only to test your concept. So is there an agent here?
no agent.
No agent. That is excellent. No agent. Stay with the picture, stay with your observation. There is no agent, and therefore there is no potential to cause harm. Let's look at this picture now. Again, a little more complication by inserting a bullock cart and a man crossing the street or the road. Is there an agent here?
People are saying yes.
Yes, there is an agent here. There is an agent here. Perhaps this is a bullock cart. He's actually looking at the bullock cart. He's possibly doing what you and I do when we cross a road. So he's crossing the path, and this is a bullock cart. So yes, there is an agent, the bullock cart. But is he likely to cause him harm? It is very low that the agent will cause him harm. So really, this may have there is a hazard. Your job is to identify the hazard. In this stage, your job is to identify the hazard, not to talk about risk. We are only identifying hazards. So yes, there is a hazard. This is there is a hazard. It can cause harm, but the potential is very low. Now let's look at this. Do you see now here? Do you think there is a hazard in this place?
Yes.
Yes, there is. Okay. Yeah, go ahead. Tell me. Yes, there is a hazard here, and you can see the chaos that is happening. Okay. Now, we did say that in the case of hazard, there is also the term conditions. When you go to a market and you see a place like this, does it give you a feeling, these unhygienic conditions, does it give you a feeling that there will not be a potential to cause harm? You will get the impression very quickly, yes, this is a very unhygienic processing or sale of fruits and vegetables. The very fact that there is a fly on this piece of bread or cake, whatever it is, will give you a condition that this is a very unhygienic storage, or fungus on a fruit. These are all conditions which tell you that there is a potential for harm. So you can see in one case we defined an agent, in the next case we can define a condition. So when you enter a factory, looking at the factory itself should give you a reason to believe whether it has a potential to cause harm. Okay, so you extend the hazard identification in food to biological, chemical, and physical hazard. So you can see all these things are covered there. I'm not going through it, but I'm only mentioning it because you can keep this in your mind. Let's come to the second layer, characterization. Basically, what we are saying, if I am going to be harmed by this hazard, how severe is this harm? So I can either describe it in quantitative terms or qualitative terms. So there are quantitative terms, qualitative terms. I'm not going into this dose response. This will be done in the next lecture. So I'm just hoping that you will keep it in mind. But let me look at some of these, this description of the harm consequent to the exposure, etc. So here, I'm just giving you an idea of a hazard characterization, but this is only in qualitative terms. So you can see this young gentleman has fallen off his bike and perhaps he's hurt himself a little bit, but from his expression, I think his pride is hurt much more than any other physical harm. So very often, a characterization of a hazard can be expressed in a qualitative term. It can also be done in a quantitative term, which you will see in the next lecture. So I'm giving you an example of this young little boy who has fallen off his bike. But I'm also giving you an example of another person who has been hit by a car. Obviously, between the two situations, the harm here will be much more severe than the harm here. So what are we doing? We are looking at the severity of the harm in a qualitative fashion, okay, and consequent to the exposure to the hazard. Remember, these three conditions must be met when you do hazard characterization. The consequences of the exposure to the hazard that you will call, that's causing the harm. So the severity of harm can be defined or found out by that. I've given you examples again in a microbiological situation. I'm not going, but you can see the harm being shown, the characterization, all in terms of qualitative terms. Okay. Now we come to the third part. So we know how severe, if a hazard were to affect me or cause an adverse effect, how severe is that effect? That is called hazard characterization. Now, simple thing is, if I do not come anywhere near the hazard, or if I do not consume that hazard, there is no exposure to that hazard, therefore I cannot come to any harm. Remember, there may be a hazard, it may have the potential to cause harm, like the crocodile, but I'm nowhere near that crocodile or that field or that ground where the crocodile is existing. I'm in another city or in another town. I'm not exposed. So if I'm not exposed, that crocodile is not going to cause me any harm. So is there a risk to me? The risk is absolutely zero. So please remember, therefore, a hazard may be present. It may also have the potential to cause harm, example being the crocodile. However, I am living in another city or nowhere where this crocodile is, therefore I am at no risk. So remember how the thing scales up. There is a hazard. You ask the question, does it have the potential? The answer will be yes or no. It has the potential to cause you harm. Is that harm? How severe is that harm? So which is the characterization? So you say it is very severe, it is not severe. Finally, will it harm me? In general, these three things are present, but will it harm me? If I am nowhere near that hazard, there is no likelihood that the hazard is going to harm me. It is like saying, if I do not eat any food, will I be taking any substances that will cause harm? The answer is no. But then you have to eat food, and therefore the substances, you are exposed to all the substance that will cause you harm. Therefore, the most important thing for us is, we know all these hazards are existing. You also know that a crocodile exists. So we know it is existing. We know it has the potential to cause harm. And we know also the harm that a crocodile might pose is very, very severe. It could be death. However, if I have no exposure, there is no harm to me. There is no risk. Therefore, if you see in the whole risk assessment steps, the exposure assessment is of the highest importance, because many of the hazards have already been identified. In food also, most of the hazards are already identified. So here's this thing, what the Act says, the Food Safety Act says. Therefore, we need to collect and collate and analyze and summarize all the scientific and technical data relating to consumption of the food, because it's only from consumption of the food are we exposed to the risks related. The related risks could be pesticide residue, toxins, etc. So obviously there has to be food consumption to be exposed. Secondly, all these other things that are there, which are possibly not so important. So now I'm going to ask you the question, how does exposure happen? So if you see here in the first picture here, hazard is something that will cause you harm. We have done this. Now, only if I am exposed, if I am swimming in the same ocean or river, wherever the shark is also doing the same, then I have hazard plus the exposure, and that causes the risk. So hazard by itself does not cause a risk. Hazard must have an exposure to cause me risk. Okay, so please keep this in mind as we go further. I'll just give you some more instances. So here there is an exposure. You can see the exposure happening with this child. He's looking in the other direction when there is a traffic coming this way. So the child is exposed, and you know, therefore, there is a likelihood of a risk. Sorry. Here also you can see again school children exposed, but between these two pictures, the exposure here is much higher than the exposed here. Here, because this is a highway or a road where these are cars are going to be moving, whereas here the cars are not going to be moving. Therefore, the exposure is far less here. So also when you do exposure, there will always be higher exposure or lower exposure. And that's how we assess what is the risk that will happen due to exposure. Remember, exposure causes risk. So the hazard by itself does not cause a risk. Here I'm giving you some more examples of exposure. Of course, here is high exposure to a wild animal, and therefore there is going to be a risk. In this case, again, another high exposure to a shark and causes you risk. In the third one, the exposure is there, but the risk is low once again because of this. I mean, the guy will not be cuddling this little tiger if there was a high risk. Very often, the exposure in daily life is exposed by a stomachache and all kinds of things. And in a qualitative way, we have vomiting, diarrhea, etc. So, very often in a microbiological sense, when we have exposures to a microbiological hazard, there is a qualitative expression of what happens. Worst thing is that you might land up in a hospital with severe diarrhea, and also death can happen. Therefore, even in a qualitative scenario, as a hazard, I mean, the risk can be very, very severe. This is something that Dr. Sudarshan will do for you. When it's a chemical, you can do a dose-related kind of a exposure and find out where we are in terms of the hazard. So, finally, if you want to characterize a risk, when I say characterize a risk, I simply mean high, low, medium, or no. You need three things to happen. You have to have a hazard, that is an agent with the potential to cause harm. You know how much is the harm, high, low, medium. And in order for a risk to exist, I must have the third element called exposure. So all these three elements will give rise to a risk. The risk can be high or low depending on this. So it can be high because the probability may be high or the severity may be high. In case of hazard characterization, the severity may be high. In case of exposure, the probability also may be high. So that's how any one of this is zero or not present, the risk will also not be present. So here is this, we'll do it very quickly because I want to finish it up very quickly now. So for example, here is a hazard, but there is no risk. So I'm asking the question, is there a hazard? The answer is yes. Is there a risk? The answer is no. Why? Because there is no exposure. Is there, now if I put an exposure, is there a risk now? The answer is yes. Is the risk level high or low or no? The risk is high. So this is the way you do it. You ask the question, is there a hazard? Yes. Is there an exposure? It may be yes or no. If it is no, then there is no risk. If the exposure is there, then yes, there is a risk. And if there is a risk, ask the last question, is it high or low? Now, how did you come to this conclusion, high or low? You know what a shark does to a person in water. It's a qualitative here, but you can do it also quantitative. Now, if you go to the next question, again, you ask, is there a higher hazard? The answer is no, because this is actually a stuffed crocodile. So, answer, is there a risk? Now, because this man is looking into a stuffed crocodile, the answer again is no. It's a stuffed crocodile. So there is no hazard. Is there an exposure because you can see him looking into his jaws? The answer is no, because again, it's a stuffed crocodile. There is no hazard. And is there a risk? There is no. So you can see a second situation. In the third situation, is there a hazard? Yes. Is there a risk? There is no exposure, so there is no risk. So there is no risk. Now, there is exposure. Someone is holding the crocodile. So is there a exposure now? Yes, there is exposure now. Is there a risk? We say there is a low risk. So ask these 3 or 4 questions. And if you ask them correctly, you will be able to do risk assessment fairly easily. So I'll just go now very quickly to risk management, maybe 3 minutes. I think, do I have time or 3 minutes is okay, Doctor? Dr. Shetty? Okay.
Sir, yeah, maybe another 5-10 minutes.
Yeah, I'll finish in another 5 minutes.
Yeah.
So now we finish risk assessment, as we said. Now it has to go to risk management. So what does the risk manager do? So let's see very quickly what a risk manager. We have said this, it's distinctive from risk assessment. I've also given you the example of the diagnostician and your family doctor. So keep that in mind, and we'll get into now risk management. So here is the risk assessment we did. We said the risk is very high because the exposure is there. So there is a high risk of this man being attacked, but he still wants to see a lion in the wild. So he has managed the risk by going into one of these big zoos, parks, national parks, and then he can observe the lion in the wild. Same thing this guy is doing. What is he done finally? The difference between this and this is the management of this risk. The same thing with the shark. It's the management of the risk. So risk management is managing the risk by using a proper option. This is the option that the risk manager has taken, that you can go and see a wild lion in the park, but you have to be there with a jeep which is protected, and these guys know the area around. So I'll give you some of the example of risk. So we did this. There is a risk here with this young boy. So now we have to manage this risk. How are we going to do it? So this is what happens to the school children. Actually, the school children are taken to school. So I am managing the risk. I am not getting rid of the risk. The risk is still there, but now I'm managing. So risk management is not about banning foods or banning substances. It is about managing the risk. Unless it cannot be managed, then possibly you will ban it. Okay, so you can't ban cars and roads, etc., because there is a risk to a child. You will manage the risk in presence of those hazards that are there. Now I can have an option. Here is the parent taking the child to the school, but I have an option where there are safety officers who will take care of the child. Or there is another option where I have a yellow bus that takes the children to school. I have deliberately put this thing here because you see a lot of yellow buses in our country taking children to school, but they do not understand that it is supposed to be a risk management where it is yellow, deliberately kept so that all motorists identify a school bus. And the rule is that when a school bus stops, traffic from both sides of the road must stop. So the traffic from this side behind the bus stops. The traffic that is coming from the other side also stops. The understanding, the risk manager says that children can run from any side of the road. So they can run this way, they can run from behind as well. So that is why the traffic stops. But that is a risk. We have colored our buses yellow, but we don't follow the protocol. So finally, I think I'll come to the last slide. Remember, risk analysis is a continuous process. So how does it happen? What is step one when we do this? Step one is identifying the hazard. From where does the hazard come? It comes from a monitoring. Somewhere it has come from somewhere, but we'll follow the trail. So first is identify this hazard, do a risk assessment, hazard characterization, exposure. This is all what we did under assessment. Then you go to the risk manager. The risk manager makes the option, chooses the option, assesses all the options available, chooses the option, implements the option. Very often we implement options by way of standards and regulations. So these are all implementation of the options. Then I monitor the options that I'm implementing. We are doing a lot of enforcement. So the enforcement is the implementing part of the risk manager. He is monitoring so if we say, for example, solids non-fat in milk, for example, we find that solids non-fat in this are being is a failure in milk. So are we monitoring this? Do we know which states fail miserably in SNF? Do we know which FBOs are monitoring in this? Do we know whether the method of analysis is correct or not correct? So we will monitor and review. And if there is an issue there, then again, we will do an assessment of policy. So you see the whole cycle moves. And this is why I say risk assessment is a predictive thing. That is the end of this lecture. Thank you so much for listening and bearing with me. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis. It was, I think, a very pleasant and very nice presentation. And, hope we have put a nice foundation, for the next lecture by Dr. Sudarshan. And we will keep the questions towards the end, so that, we don't have to, break the thought.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis. And now, Dr. Sudarshan?
Yeah, I'm online.
Okay. You can try sharing your slide also.
Yeah, I'm trying.
Yeah, I've had a nice, almost 1 hour of very nice, discussion kind of a presentation, where the idea on what is risk and what is the perception of risk has been discussed with the food as well as non-food point of view. Now, Dr. Sudarshan will take it forward, on the how the risk analysis is done. Dr. Sudarshan, now it's your...
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, okay. Now,
Yeah.
my sharing, I think you have to allow me to share, something like that.
No need. And you click directly, it will be no permission required. It will allow you. Yeah, it is getting shared slowly.
Okay.
Now you have to open your presentation in the full screen mode. Yes.
Yeah, is okay.
Yes, you can now make it full screen. Yeah.
Yeah, I have made it.
Good.
Can I go ahead?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, good afternoon once again. I think at the outset, I would like to thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity. Now, Dr. Lewis has made my job very easy, because he has made a template where I'll be just putting some science behind it, because he has shown you the things which are very obvious to you, because you can easily identify the hazard and try to. That's what actually in a day-to-day life we'll be doing it. But when we want to know what you can see, then our problem becomes a little difficult. So I'll try to explain you the science behind this, whatever earlier Dr. Lewis has said. So I'll be imposing some of the information, whatever he has told you, in terms of food safety. Okay. So as he said in his first slide itself, that actually we are traditional food safety system, which we are following for quite some time back, Prevention of Food Adulteration Act, where it was a reactive approach. The main responsibility, we always used to think that government has to do it, so that the food supplies in the market has to be taken care by the government. So it was only reactive approach, and there was no structured risk analysis. It was entirely relying on the end product. Finally, what comes into market, you'll just check at that time point and try to see whether it is okay or not okay. So the end process was not being checked. So the level of risk reduction in that traditional food safety system was not satisfactory. That's why we have shifted from this modern food safety system. Here, the entire approach is that the preventive approach and the shared responsibility. The food safety is a shared responsibility. You can't just say that FSSAI will take care of everybody who are involved in this, producers, consumers, industry, regulators. Everybody is a shareholder, and they have to do their duty so that the food safety is ensured. And this is the science-based food safety system that we are talking about. It uses the risk analysis. This is the basis for the science. This is based on science. So it establishes priorities that is required actually to manage the risk, and it integrates with food control system. Earlier Dr. Lewis has told you earlier it was only the end product. Now we have to see from farm to fork, entire food chain. There could be a problem anywhere in between. So we have to actually see the entire this system is integrated so that we can appropriately manage the risk, and it relies on the process control. If your process is good enough to take at a different point of time how we manage that, the whatever the problems we expected, the end products will be able to actually control it much more easily than the earlier system where it was only end product testing, okay, inspection or test. So the level of risk reduction is very much improved because we are taking care of the entire process, the entire food chain also, so that the ultimately the product that comes in the market is not have to worry much. So what is risk analysis? It's a framework to review and respond to food safety problems in a systematic structure. These three important things. When we are talking about the science spaces, systematic, structured, and scientific way in order to enhance the quality of decision making. Dr. Lewis has shown you in different situations how we actually react and identify the risk. So for that decision making, we should have this entire systematic, structured, and scientific way of doing things. Then we'll have the same result, irrespective of whoever is doing. If you have this entire system in place, that's the idea. So what are the principles of these things? As Dr. Lewis, because I'll be taking his name very often because he has already put the template before you. So there are three components. What is the risk assessment, risk management, and risk communication? All these three are interrelated. So they work independently, but their information has to pass on from one place to system to other system. Okay. So whatever the scientific data that we are talking about should be applied consistently. That means we should have uniform policy of using that information so that the risk management will be the same, and to be open and transparent. It should be available for anybody to check so that how it has been done. This transparency always gives you a confidence that what we are doing is right and documented. That means how we have arrived at this particular risk management decision is, if thoroughly documented, then we not have to really worry about whether the decision made is correct or not, because you will be knowing that on what basis this has been done, and you will, because we say it's as transparent, you can just see, and it is documented. You can go through the document and try to see that how the issue has been solved. And on the basis of, and second thing is the continuous process. As in his last slide, he showed you that it's a continuous process. This science is very dynamic. We'll be having information generated every now and then on various issues. So based on that latest information, if we have to look some of the management decisions or the risk assessment decisions we have to, methods we have done, we have to actually change and try to appropriately make the amendments. Okay. And also the most important thing is there will be always some uncertainty. We will be not knowing the entire thing in anything. So will be some uncertainty that also has to be taken care when we are putting this, when we are using this analysis. How to manage. Okay. And the risk communication is the interactive exchange of information, because we will be putting the information on the website, they'll be putting it, and sometimes information also comes through the FBOs, food safety officers, all those things, and also from the industry. Right now, latest is that trans fat thing that is coming, and then of course maybe a few days back, even the school menu, this thing also has been in the school canteens. What should be the type of foods that should be available also has been made. These are the things that happen based on this entire process. So the other important thing in the risk analysis should be based on all available scientific that we have discussed. Perceptions also, the risk perceptions can vary. What is okay for India or in some parts of India may not be okay for some other parts of India. The perception will also has to be taken into consideration when we are actually trying to address the risk. And costs also very important. Sometimes costs will be so high that your ultimate result is that you will not be able to have enough food to eat, So that is not a good management option. So we also have to see the costs of the using this assets, and I mean the management decisions that we take. Environmental, in this context, I try to tell you that some of the environmental contaminants we see in India, like lead, cadmium. Sometimes they said more people die because of pollution in India. That's what they say. So it's environmental pollution which our foods are times. So this environment under which we are working also has to be taken into consideration when we are actually doing the risk. Okay, so this environment of India may not be same as what we are doing in USA or Europe or some other place where the pollution, this thing is much better. The pollutants may not be not that in high concentration that we see in India. So that also is a cultural factors. Some of the is when we try to say the most important thing in the risk analysis, in the risk assessment itself, is said exposure assessment. Here, when you say exposure assessment, the how we consume food in India, these cultural factors also very important. In India, in other countries probably is that we are not supposed to sell the unpasteurized milk. But in cultural factors in India, that almost everybody in India, they'll just they buy raw milk with the dabbawala, which is not pasteurized, but you just boil and then further use it. So these cultural practices that we are not really bothered about the salmonella, which is the major organism generally we are associated with the milk products. So this is a cultural practice is ingrained in our culture that we actually take care of that. Maybe we will not be knowing the science of it, but we ensure that risk is managed. So these are cultural factors. Okay, so which is gathered and analyzed according to scientific. Again, the principles will be same. But this entire thing, that's what Dr. Lewis also has said. We are only not trying to see how they have managed this. We are only trying to use that principles of risk analysis and try to manage the risk. It will be different. How we manage risk, because alternative, as he said, it can be so many things. Like, earlier we never used to have that yellow buses for school children. Now as a policy, they have taken that all these school children or generally school buses should be in the yellow color. But this type of decision may not be there in other countries where they may be taking some other decision, but still the entire thing is how to manage the risk is this thing, but the principles will be same. So what will be the end product of this one? This will develop an estimate of risk to human health and safety and identify and implement appropriate measures. This is where once you do the risk analysis, how you are managing the risk, control the risks, and communicate with stakeholders about the risks and the measures applied. All these three components, this is the outcome of the risk analysis. So what is required for a successful risk analysis? A well-functioning food system. Now we think that food safety and standards, earlier this entire food control system was under different ministries in India. Now we have a single window. Food Safety and Standards Authority of India will take care of, and they have actually developed the systems to ensure that the food is safe and supported participation of key stakeholders. This is where, say, government, industry, academia, the best example that I can tell you is right now I told that's transfer an issue. So, but you have to have the cooperation from industry. They have to reduce, they have to modify their processing systems, processing of vanaspati in such a way that this use. You require their cooperation. Academia, a lot of information is required. For taking some of the decisions, we ask the universities to do this type of work and try to give us the information for risk analysis. But also consumers. As I said, risk perception itself will depend upon the consumer perception, and these consumers will be different for different. The perception will be different for different people. So we have to have that information before carrying out this thing. And the basic knowledge of this, of course, the entire process. Somebody should have the idea of how to go about doing it. So now we say that these are a few examples that will go deep, tell you how it is being done. So ADI, this means acceptable daily intake for additives and residues. These are science-based activities which have actually resulted based on the risk analysis. That now we have this. So these are even labels to warn consumers about potential risk. Some of those things cannot be even giving the information itself to the consumers itself will be able to manage some of the risks. So that will be okay. So all these things are the of doing the hello. Hello, there is some this thing Shetty.
Yeah, I'm just trying to remove that person. You go ahead.
Okay.
You go ahead.
So now we'll come to the risk. We told three components: risk assessment, risk management, and risk communication. Now we'll go to the first one is the risk assessment. So here, as he said in earlier this thing, so what is the risk? You have a template, you know what is this. It's a function of the probability of an adverse health effect and severity of that effect. That's what. So all these component here has shown you that how we actually use hazard, then what is the probability, and what is the consequence of that. All those things are the risk. And what is the hazard? It's a biological, chemical, or physical agent in our conditions. Conditions. He explained to you if this thing crocodile is stuffed. Or it's alive, this thing, if it's a baby, what is the risk? If it's a this one, what is the risk? If it's stuffed but still a crocodile, what is this thing? So that is what is the condition put with potential to cause an adverse health effect. So all these things are that will define the hazard. So when we come to the foods now, we'll superimpose the information in whatever he has Dr. Lewis has said. But here, when we talk about food, so we can classify the type of hazards in food to three categories. Physical contaminant. Physical contaminant, I can give you a best example in India is that the iron filings in your tea powder. You take tea powder or a loose tea powder which is available in the market and try to use a very powerful magnet, you will find a lot of iron filings sticking to your magnet. So this is actually physical contaminant. Of course, hair, all those bones sometimes in the meat and their products will be physical contaminants examples. And chemical contaminants can be your pesticide residues, veterinary drug residues, and other environmental contaminants which come through the environment. And also, of course, additives cannot be called as a contaminant, but it can become a hazard if the levels are different. So we'll come to that little later. Then the biological contaminants are the one which, bacteria, parasites, all these things called contaminants. When we are trying to do the risk assessment for these three different things, so you need to have a different type of approach. So what is the input data for risk assessment? You should have foods. You should know, the risk from different foods will be different. Now I explained to you milk. If it is not pasteurized, you may have a different types of this thing. If milk is converted to khoya or milk, this thing, desiccated milk, then if you are not storing in proper place, you will have a different type of hazard. Okay, so you should have that information and hazards, or possible things that can be there with a particular food, and population groups. What is okay for a children, what is okay for an adult may not be okay for children, or okay for some population because of their this thing background may not be okay for us. So this type of information is also process models. Is that how it has been? Entire thing has been processed. We told you that it has to be from farm to fork. And consumption models, I told that each different cultural, there is a cultural this thing on the type of food that we eat. In South India itself, we'll have Karnataka has a different type of food habits. Andhra may have, Telangana may have, or even Tamil Nadu may have a different type of these things models. And dose response models it relates to hazard and its effect on the characterization. Okay. And health outcomes and what is that, So do we have that information that just now Dr. Lewis has told you that if you have some bacteria or food, what will happen? You will have a stomach ache, vomiting, diarrhea type of things, or some of those things like lead may cause plumbism. Okay, if you have arsenic in your environment contaminant, you may have a cancer. Okay, so all these things are the health outcomes depending upon the type of hazard that we are encountering. So type of risk assessment, again, they can be further classified to microbiological and chemical, because the risk assessment, doing microbiological risk assessment is little different from chemical risk assessment. In a microbiological risk assessment, there are so many these things which taken care when we are actually doing the risk assessment. The virulence of the, if we talk about some microorganism or like a pathogen, so we have to see the virulence of that organism, the number of organisms present, whether the immunity of host, I mean the person who is taking. Okay, so there are so many 7 or 8 different conditions which actually have to be taken into consideration when we are really doing the microbiological risk assessment. Okay, so that is little different chemical risk assessment. Chemical risk assessment, it essentially goes on the dose response. That means we know that different doses will have a different effects. So based on that concept, so we'll be doing the chemical risk assessment. Relatively, this is easier than for what we do for microbiological risk assessment. So Dr. Lewis has told you hazard identification, hazard characterization. These are the 4 components of risk assessment. We'll just see that you have already learned what is hazard. So anything which can likely to cause some health of this thing is hazard. So here again, we're going to take chemicals. We also have 2 types of things that can happen in your chemicals. The threshold chemicals, that where we actually have the dose responses, we can actually monitor the dose response, and then it is according to the dose. That means if you control the dose, we'll be able to see the outcome will be controlled. Okay. So there are some non-threshold chemicals also, like maybe some of the carcinogens, where it may be very difficult to have this dose response properly, because in some we cannot exactly extrapolate that if you take X amount of one contaminant, you will end up having a cancer or something like that. So they are called non-threshold chemicals. Okay. So risk assessment for them is different from the threshold chemicals. So most of our chemicals like pesticide residues or veterinary drug residues are in some of the contaminants. All those things are additives. All those things fall into the threshold chemicals. Okay. So for health-based, so how do we do that? This thing, for these chemicals to have an impact on your health, it will take. Yeah, so supposing something can cause some kidney problem, you imagine, but it doesn't cause with the small quantity that we consume on an everyday. So it may end up having that disease maybe after 20 years. But should we have to wait for 20 years to have that effect, or we have other methods to assess the risk and try to minimize the risk? So that's where we have this health-based guideline values. Like ADI, I'll explain to you in detail. One is the acceptable daily intakes, and the same thing actually is converted. If you're talking about additives, we say generally acceptable daily intake. If you are talking about the contaminants, we may say tolerable daily intake, but both are same actually. And some of the environmental contaminants which we probable tolerable weekly intake, some of those things may not come into your diet very often, but over a period of so you may have some exposure. So that is the baseline, guideline values which we'll be using actually to see whether we are at risk or no risk. And as he said, this thing examples has given is essentially qualitative. That means whether there is a risk, low risk or high. Say in a different settings, in whether there is a no risk, low risk or high risk, depending upon the situation that we have encountered. But there are this thing also, we should be able to tell, if you take the X amount of this particular consumption is there at this level, hazard is there. So what will happen? This type of data is very useful for the risk managers. We will be able to take a decision saying to what extent we can actually allow the risk, depending upon the effect that you see. So there's a number of cases per million. Many a time, foodborne disease, especially if you want to control the salmonella in your food. So we have to tell them, if you reduce this, how many people are less likely to have this disease, because over a period of time. So that type of information will help them to have set goals to reduce the risk. Okay. So annual cases, in sometimes you may not even find any disease, but it will disability. You may fall ill and you recover, but you may not. But still, the loss of those 3 days or 4 days, or sometimes some of those things are permanent on your health. So all those things are also calculated as DALYs. Okay, disabled adjust life years. Okay, so that's how you can have a quantitative risk assessment done. So hazard identification, characterization, these actually are done because now most of you, I think, are students who do a lot of experiments or are likely to do some experiments. So how do we do it? We can't do all these things in humans, right? So we should have studies done, scientific studies done, in vitro studies. Sometimes now this thing is the restriction on using the animals even for the laboratory purposes. So in vitro studies are done before actually to reduce the use of laboratory animals. So cultured organisms or even cells, tissue preparations from. So all those things are the latest trends in trying to understand the toxicity of various these things. And in vivo studies in laboratory animals and humans. Sometimes for additives, we also have some human studies, human clinical trials are also done. Okay, so all these things are part of the hazard identification and characterization. Hazard identification, I told you all those things which can give you like pesticide residues, veterinary drug residues, even additives, all those things are likely to cause some health hazard at different conditions. So that's what we are trying to manage that. So definition of exposure conditions, sorry. So here, what is very important is this dose response relations, because I told you I am going more into science, is that this dose is hazard characterization is a very critical component of identifying the type of health effect that we see. Appropriate animal model, since animal models, supposing if you are working on some hazard which actually has no effect on particular animal model and you end up saying that there is no effect, is wrong. So we have to identify the right type of animal model and try to see, and most sensitive animals have to be taken to understand the type of effect that is likely to have, that particular hazard is likely to create. Okay, so we know that no experimental Swiss is ideal for humans, right? So that means you can't, but we try to, for each type of disease, we identify animal model which may be very close to the animal human systems, but no one particular animal is not total. You can't replace that with humans cannot be replaced. So animals generally provide effective means of evaluating potential. So this will give you a very estimate of what is likely to happen, but it's not absolutely true that what can happen in animals will be totally, we will be able to reproduce in humans. But we'll try to identify a very close animal model which can give some information. So adequacy of design conduct should be according to good laboratory practice. When you try, they many times people come to us saying that we have done this study, but very important is that a design and conduct of this particular animal experiments or whatever experiments have to be as per good laboratory practices. Many times they may not be doing for the intended use, but you may have a lot of interpretations done on animal experiments which may not be useful for risk analysis because type of data, to evaluate. That systematic this thing information has to be collected. The type of studies, this is not if hazard you need to do all these things, but most of the studies are done for depending upon the type of toxicity. I said depending upon the type of hazard, the type of toxicity it is likely to create in this thing animals. Based on that, we have to choose which of the test studies are required to be doing. So acute toxicity, long-term toxicity, mutagenicity. You have to see whether this particular this thing does it a mutagen or a carcinogen, and of course, does it have any impact on the fetus? Or nothing will happen to the first generation, maybe second generation is getting affected. All this information is depending upon the type of toxicity that particular has actually show. And then finally, we come to once you have all that information, then we finally try to understand that what dose. I told you that it is dose response that is most critical for this chemical risk assessment. So we try to understand that which is the concentration at which we have seen that low observed adverse effects. The severity, high, low, or those things qualitative terms. So finally, we try to see that where exactly in which concentration we have the minimum effect. So that is where we are able to see some effect in the animal, so-called low observed adverse effect level. From there, you further reduce the dose of this hazard to an extent that it doesn't have any impact on the animal. That particular this thing is called NOEL. So all these things Dr. Lewis has shown you, but he didn't discuss, but I'm trying to tell you. So that is actually derived. That is no observed adverse effect level. What it means is that at that concentration of that whatever the hazard or physical, biological or chemical contaminant, it doesn't have any effect on the animals. That means absolutely normal. Okay, that is the concentration that we identify. That is called NOEL, no observed adverse effect level. So this is a very critical input that is required when you actually do the risk characterization. So you need all this classical information also. Other than that is absorption, how a particular chemical is absorbed, distributed, metabolism, excretion, how it is. All things you how this particular this thing is likely to which affected. All those things will come out based on this type of study. So. So this is, I think, if you understand that there are various types of studies are required to understand the nature of this hazard, that is the characterization. And those levels are toxic, but see what we try to do, especially I am giving an example in terms of additive. So we try to identify a dose level which cause death or severe suffering at the highest dose level. So, as acute toxicity, all those things, I think in earlier situations, we used to talk LD, lethal dose 50, where 50% of animals die. That is the highest dose that we give, try to understand how toxic is that particular this thing. So we should not go to that extent, and then we should be working at much lower this thing and try to identify this point of departure is nothing but the where actually the lowest observed adverse effect we have identified, and frame we have come down to the no observed adverse effect level. Okay, so this is the reference point for hazard characterization. As I told, you can't wait for the particular disease symptoms to come out, because I said it can take so many years for that to happen. So this data is useful in trying to actually manage the risk. So if you have this particular dose where it doesn't have any humans, that is the point where we use this for the risk hazard characterization. So we will not be okay. So this risk assessment advice, we told you that in some cases we say high, low, medium. Wherever we have very good data, we can able to estimate actually how many number of people are likely to be affected at this concentration. We'll give quantitative 1 in million, 2 in million, or something like that. And that is health-based guideline value. We'll be looking for ADI. Only try to see that your total exposure doesn't go beyond this acceptable intake. So that I told you how this is derived. I'll come to that here. But many times, very well, if you are all science students, that the laboratory, the doses that we use in laboratory animals is much higher, enormously higher than actually humans exposed in normal patients. Only to try to find out the nature of the toxicity, we do that. So, as I told you, most relevant endpoint. What we mean by relevant endpoint, I told you that sensitivity of the particular animal for that particular hazard, and that because you may have different endpoints, but which one is more relevant for us, that has to be identified. So this is where the valid scientific data that is generated, we'll be looking at it. Okay, so all the data that is available may not be useful when we do this risk analysis. Many times we find we'll be looking for that type of information. So as I said earlier also, we have to keep in mind that there's always an uncertainty. So that also has to be taken care. So what we do is, once you develop this NOEL and you identify a NOEL for one particular hazard, then we try to take test species to humans. We are actually extrapolating this information from animal experiments to the humans, right? So the uncertainty factor we have to use, because we may not be knowing certain things. So take care of that uncertainty. We use 10. And then within the humans, there will be each person will be actually reacting to some hazard differently. So there's a natural variation that we have. So to take care of that, another 10. So 10 into 10, 100. So what we do is whatever the NOEL, that is the X value that you get where you don't have any effect on the animal, that divided by 10, another 10 is 100, 10 into 10, 100. So NOEL by 100 is usually taken as the acceptable daily intake. So what do we say by acceptable daily intake? So acceptable daily intake is an estimate, an amount of calories on a body weight basis. This is very important. Per body, so children is their body weight is less, so their exposure has to be less. The adult weighing 60 kg, it is these people we try to see that how much you are exposed to see per kg body weight of your body weight, and try to see whether you are actually cross area itself. I told you is 100 times less than the NOEL. NOEL itself is no effect. Further down, we are taking another safety factor or uncertainty factor of 100 and trying to arrive a value. ADI, or sometimes we call it tolerable daily intake. ADI, as you told you, we use that for additives. Tolerable daily for the contaminants, but it is both are same. The definition is same. So there is the relation between ADI, NOEL, and LOEL. You can just see that, as I said, that LOEL is the one where we have from there. Let's say you have this is a much lower. Then further down, we'll be using this 100. This is much lower. Okay. So many times you may cross additives or certain things. Some may cross ADI. Sometimes, not always. If it happens on an everyday basis, we have to work on that. We have to reduce the risk. But if it happens less frequently, not on a daily basis, it is of no health consequences, because I told you that you have this 100 margin even for the NOEL. Okay, so occasional excursion of ADI is no health concern. Okay, happening on a regular basis, if you are crossing it, then definitely we have to reduce the exposure by manipulating the levels that are permitted or exposures. So these exposure assessment are done at two levels. One is if supposing somebody is actually developed a new pesticide and he wants to use on a food crop, right? So he'll come, or some food additive people have actually identified. Now there's a lot of that requirements come, and that is a pre-regulation. Before we regulate, actually we try to see whether exposures are whatever the requirement, this toxicology, all that AD, all those things, whether we meet for whatever the food that he's requesting it. So that is a pre-regulation. Post-regulation is we try to, as we say, that it's a continuous process. We should be regularly monitoring our exposure so that your risks are minimized. So this is a post-regulation. Okay. So what is the requirement of the third component? Once I told you that hazard we have identified, hazard characterization we have done with the various animal experiments or toxicity studies, and then the third one is the exposure aspect. So as he said, for risk is based on the hazard into exposure. So exposure becomes very critical to have any risk, right? So what is the requirement of this? How do we do the risk exposure assessment? We need the concentration of the food additive or a contaminant in food. Whatever the foods you consume, we need to have that information. What is the quantity of that contaminant or additive in that particular food? Amount of food consumed and average body weight of the population. And when we do for at country level, we'll be taking average. If somebody has to do it personal level, they have to take their own weight and try to check. But when we do these regulations or set the limits, we'll be doing at the average. This thing that's I said. The JECFA takes, Joint Expert Committee on Food Additives, they take at 60 kg, but there is an option to say that depending upon the type of population we are catering to, we have an option to use what is the weight that we can actually use in a condition where it can be higher depending upon the type of population. So the equation is that concentration of food and into food consumption divided by the body weight. So then what we will get? We'll get the milligrams per kg body weight, right? So this has to be compared with the just now. And of course, the other thing that we do is when we take, we try to exposures, we try to do is we check the 95th percentile value, in the sense that almost extreme consumptions also we take, so that even at that concentration, at that level of consumption also, people who take little higher quantities than the normal distribution. So we call it different, this I think slide, you can easily make out that what is the percentile what we are talking. So we have mean, median, and then we have 95th percentile, and of course you go to extreme, that will be outlier. So with 95th percentile value of a food consumption if we take, so we will be able to take care of everybody below that, so that we do extreme food consumptions to ensure that food you take, most of them do not take that quantity of food, but we'll try to do that at that extreme case. So worst case scenario we take, and then try to see the exposure and try to see whether you fall below the ADI or above ADI. Then we are sure that we are taking care of population. So how do you do that? You need to have food consumption data. Then various methods of doing this, population-based diet surveys. Sometimes we use per capita consumption also if you don't have any information. But this type of information is not useful for food. Contaminants may be okay for for milk, cereal, something that we can use that data, but not for processed food where the consumption is not on a regular basis. It will be on a frequency consumption. So per capita consumption will give a wrong information. So the other one is household based. So you do the diet surveys at household level and try to see at household level what is the consumption. And of course, if you want to target only additives, individual based more, because you can capture what are all the food person is taking, which will be different frequency, consumption, all those things will vary from person to person than at a household level. The other factor that is required for to do this acceptable daily intake, we have to have the body weight. I just now try to explain to you saying that this option of 60 kg is when you're actually trying to do at this thing level, but they said depending upon your population, body weights of your population, you can. So average body weight, they have done it in the JECFA when they are trying to do is they take as a reference 60 kg, for children 15 kg, and for Asian population they suggest 55. But we are little conservative, we still take much less because our body weights are much less than these averages. So we when we do this risk assessment in India, we generally take 50 kg as a reference listing, so that your much reduced when we are calculating the risk. So this is a very classical this thing that as he said, presence of hazard itself is not a risk. It depends upon the dose. That's what I said. For chemical risk assessment, we essentially look for the dose response. So it is exposure that is important. And he gave different type of slides. So this is this one. You can just see that mere presence of hazard is no risk, and it is the exposure that will give you the risk. Hazard into exposure is a risk. And here you see your sun bath is fine because many people want. Now actually for COVID, somebody also tried to say at least you should stand outside this thing for half an hour or 1 hour to this thing, you get exposed to sunlight. So, this is this thing, but if it becomes exposure becomes more higher, probably you are using a risk management option of using an umbrella or something like. So how it is managed. So mere presence of the entire is around this. Mere presence of hazard in food itself is no risk. It all depends upon exposed to and under what conditions you are exposed to. So the risk management is how do we do that risk management once we identify this risk. So what are the general principles of risk management? It's the protection of human health. And it has to be, as I told you, that it has to be transparent in decision pieces that we use. And this most critical component is the functional separation of risk assessment, risk management. I think Dr. Lewis was emphasizing this in his lecture is because risk assessment will give different options. And risk managers will because they'll not this thing, they should not influence assessments panels to try to for the risk management that they are likely to take. We have to be unbiased and try to see in a very systematic way and try to do the risk and try to give different scenarios and trying to see this is the different risks that people are likely to get have this based on the different situations, and the management option depends upon so many other factors like cost, environmental factors, culture, all those things are taken into consideration. But still, the basic object is to try to see the human health is protected. Okay, and this is a continuous process. As we said, that we should be regularly working on that, depending upon the information that is generated over a period of time. So, how do this management is done? There is a food safety objective. So this food safety objective is a statement based on the risk analysis. So just now we have done the risk analysis of communication will follow, but otherwise the most important thing as a risk assessment is done. So it expresses the level of hazard in a feed that is tolerable in relation to appropriate level of protection. This will vary from the different type of foods and also countries. So many things can have this thing, but that's what I said. This system management is a little different from risk assessment. Risk assessment has to be basically on that whatever just explained, but management options will be based on the objective that a country like to have that. How do they do that? There are various methods. There are two different types of standards that are made based on this thing. One is the vertical standards. These are vertical standards are essentially product standards. Okay, so some of those things are put like for a physical contaminant. Just now explained to you that in India, a very typical example for physical contaminant can be this iron filing. There is a 150 ppm is actually limit, I think, for that one. And those things are also is a part of the vertical standards. But for horizontal standard, it's a safety standards. So what do they have? This horizontal standard. This horizontal standard means it will be across various food categories. So you see, because safety has to be ensured from all the foods. So these things are across the food category. Whatever vertical standards are product standards, so they will be individual. For each product, it will vary, but the horizontal standards will be uniform because ultimate objective is to ensure the safety. So the contaminants. So what are the things which are part of the horizontal standards? Contaminant, residues, even packaging. Because packaging is in contact with your food material. So the type of packaging that has to be go in with your food also is a part of this. And then labeling, I told you that for some of those things, if you have to give the consumers the information how to use that particular food, that information is also, you can avoid many of the food safety risks. That's why we always suggest you to read the label thoroughly so that you will not have any problems because that is a must on the label, that there's some of the advisory is also given on the label. Some of those people are allergic to some of the these things, ingredients of the foods, so they should not fall sick because of the that allergen or that type of thing. So label becomes very important to get that information. So ultimately, all the objective of all these things is ensure the safety of that food we consume. So microbiological standards. For biological hazards, microbiological standards are set. And pathogens, they should be free. Some of the these things, staphylococcus, for example, there 0 is not required, so they'll be allowing some 10 to the power of 3 CFU per gram, because there the risk will be based on the toxin production. So the concentration of that particular organism beyond certain concentration is a risk. So they limit that concentration there. But for some of those things which are even one organism can cause a disease like salmonella, it will be 0 tolerance organism. So there it will be 0. So pathogens should be free. It should be free from pathogens. So that type of standards are made for. This is the option. Then for additives, we'll be giving maximum permitted limits. That is the limit at which you can use. Many times the concentrations required to achieve that, whatever the technological function to be much lower than that. But we'll try to fix this based on the exposures and also the technological thing, of course. And pesticide residues, veterinary drug residue, this is the maximum residue leads, which actually if you do as per good agriculture practice or good animal husbandry practices, there will be still some amount of residue, which, as I said, should not cause any harm, even if it is over a lifetime. So that is the amount which is decided based on the data that we get from the manufacturers, and then exposures we do, and then the maximum residue limits in each of those things. So this will be definitely there, some small quantities in your food. The environmental contaminants, sometimes we have no actually control on these type of things, because the environment in which the food produced in India, as I told you, that pollution levels may be a little higher. So based on that, again, of course, the health is tolerance limits are made. And whenever we are not able to reach you that, we actually use the principle of ALARA. That means as low as reasonably achievable. Okay, this principle we use when we are trying to put the environmental contaminants. That becomes very, you cannot put, as I said, that you cannot put something which cannot be achieved, I mean, which cannot be practically feasible. So the option should be there, but of course, ultimately the safety has to be ensured. So I'm not, this is only to try to tell you, my next speaker will talk to you on the third component of risk analysis, the risk communication, most important, and he, as Shetty has introduced to you, he is the best communicator. So you see how he will be communicating to you next. And I think that is my last slide. Thank you for your attention. If there are any questions,
Thank you, Dr. Sudarshan. Hopefully, we have now the second block added on the foundation of knowledge created by Dr. Sudarshan. And question anyway, probably will take it towards the end. And now I would request Dr. SubbaRao. SubbaRao is Scientist E and the head of the department from the ICMR National Subnutrition. I have already introduced him in the beginning. Dr. SubbaRao, now the floor is yours to communicate.
Thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yes, yes. Voice is coming good.
One second. Can you hear me now?
Yes, very well, very well.
Okay, I'm sharing my slides.
Yeah.
Can you?
Not yet.
You can see yourself now?
Not yet shared. Now it's on the way.
Okay.
Yes, it is. Yeah. Great.
Yeah. Thank you for the opportunity, Professor Shetty, and it's very nice to see Dr. Sudarshan and Dr. Lewis remotely and listen to their erudite talk. Actually, it is so much of science, but I don't understand much of it. I will try to keep my presentation very simple. We'll have two parts in the presentation. Initial will be to deal with the concepts of what risk communication is all about. And at 2 points in the presentation, I would take help of 1 or 2 small case studies, or you can say some of the research studies that we've done as cases to explain how we went about doing it. So let's, as I said, the overview is that, we will generally talk about risk communication, what it is, and most importantly, how it is done. So in this presentation, you will try and see why, when, who, where, and what of risk communication, and most importantly, how. So by way of definition, if you want to just define, I think my earlier speakers, my predecessors have already discussed about the risk communication and its definition. Risk communication can be defined as it's an interactive process of exchange of information. Please note these words. process of exchange of information. It is not one way at all. It is exchange of information and opinions among individuals who could be consumers, or who could be risk managers, or who could be risk assessors. At the same time, the groups, institutions concerning a risk or a potential risk to human health or environment. Yet another definition similarly defines risk communication as exchange of information or opinions concerning risk-related factors among risk assessors, managers, consumers. You've seen the classical figure that both Dr. Levis and Dr. Sudarshan have shown, where risk analysis, risk management, and risk communication are shown as overlapping circles. But from risk communication, there are two arrows protruding both towards risk management and risk assessment. So that's how, I mean, the usual perception is that, and in my talk as well, I will generally touch upon risk communication for the consumer, but risk communication can happen at many levels. You can just, just to make the concept a little easier, I would take the consumer perspective largely. So, yeah, hazard versus risk. After Dr. Levis and Dr. Sudarshan have spoken, I have very little to say. Hazard is a cause of, a harm and is not very tangible. Risk is the potential of that harm, the probability of that particular harm taking place. And if you see this classic thing, risk communication figures somewhere here, and this is all a part of the risk analysis framework. Then why food safety risk communication should actually be done? We've seen that why food safety risk assessment is done. Since no food is 100% risk free, risk management is necessary, risk management is to be done. But why food safety risk related communication needs to be done? It is to increase understanding among various food safety stakeholders about the rationale behind decisions. As Dr. Sudarshan said and Levis said, the risk managers take decisions on our behalf as to how the possibility of risk can be reduced to the bare minimum possible. So this needs to be communicated to the end consumer, because the understanding about this is very, very important. Sometimes it is also done to help people to make more informed judgments. Ultimate aim of risk communication is that people know what is the hazard, people know what is the probability of that hazard, that is risk, and based on that they make a judgment of whether to buy or consume or eat or take a particular food or not. So to help people make informed choices and judgments about the foods based on the knowledge of the hazard and how that hazard can actually be how much of that hazard can actually be a risk for them or their lives or their health or whatever. And also risk communication is important because we need to inform and enhance the risk assessment. As I said, it's not just always to the consumer. It also should happen, because the risk managers should have a direct channel of communication with the risk assessors. And then the risk management decisions should need to be communicated again to both risk assessors as well as to the potential consumers. And why it is needed? Because it is to help the risk managers to understand the likely impact of their decisions. A risk manager, in his or her wisdom, can actually take a decision on behalf of the consumer to ensure that a particular food which has a potential risk is a particular way of managing that particular food in the market. But how is it being taken by the consumer? How is it being taken by the end user? Also needs to be communicated back to the risk manager. So that's why I said it's an exchange of information. It is never a top-down approach. It is a two-way approach. And it is also important to reduce the risk of food safety hazards. So risk communication should happen. It is not a once-off affair. It has to happen on a continuous basis. So what can risk communication do? A risk communication can simply improve people's physical well-being, because you're telling them what is the hazard and what is the extent of risk that is likely to happen, at what level of consumption of the food, at what frequency and what regularity. And it can also increase the consumer's trust in food supply. The better they know about the food, the trust in their regulatory system and the trust in the manufacturing system will be enhanced. Similarly, it also can help improve the environment in which we live, because the risks are minimized for animals around us, for the environment around us, and for the plant health, and also for our health. Risk communication can effectively also impact people's overall quality of life, because it addresses many other things, including considering their socioeconomic factors and livelihoods, and also psychological factors. I'll tell you how perceptions and psychological factors are also important in my later slides. So this is a slide that I borrowed from Dr. Sudarshan. When you take the traditional channels of food supply in Indian context, although we have a changed food environment scenario now, when you take the traditional channels of food supply, when you say, where do you consume your food from? Most of us would say, yeah, it's either home cooked, or when we say outside foods, it could be restaurants or street vended foods. Of course, now street vended foods are not very much in vogue, but definitely, the street vended foods are and were and will be an important part of our daily diet. And then similarly, the restaurants, and probably when I mean restaurants, I also mean online delivery systems and things like that. Outside foods that are generally consumed away from procured and consumed away from home, and also the processed foods. Processed foods could be, in fact, there in the home cooked foods as well, and some amount of processing happens at household level as well. And also in the foods that we are consuming away from home, also there could be a lot of processed foods. But when we say processed foods, we usually think they are industrially processed. And for each of them, the common understanding from earlier of our food safety related studies, we say that when people talk about home cooked foods, they are generally worried about the quality of the ingredients they are using, maybe cereals, pulses, and other things. And adulteration is seen as an important factor, because general perception among people is that there are hardly any risks related to handling or cooking of those foods at household level. But when the same consumer goes outside home and consumes, the consumer may not be too much worried about the ingredients, because the consumer always chooses the most reliable or well-reputed food joint for consumption. So the assumption generally is that with the brand, or with the brand name, or the value of that particular joint, they associate certain quality. But for them, when they are consuming foods away from home, the major concern would be safety. Similarly, when you buy processed foods or the industrially processed foods, all the foods that we take from, they are in the packed form. Most people assume that there are a lot of chemicals that are added. There are a lot of different kinds of additives that are added. So they are worried about chemicalization of the food. While as people engaged in risk management analysis, most of the scientists do know that any of these things can happen in any of these foods. Adulteration could be there in the processed foods. Adulteration could be there in our foods away from home. Similarly, safety issues could be in any of these. Even at home, there could be safety issues. I'll come to that at the end. That's going to be my second case study on household level food safety. So these are the general perceptions that people have. But while 50% of food is still procured from traditional channels of food supply. So when it comes to risk, it means different things to different people. For instance, so far we've been looking at the expert perspective of risk. What is the expert perspective of risk? An expert is a scientist, an expert is a risk manager, an expert is a person who analyzes or assesses risk. An expert thinks risk is the probability of an hazard to create a negative consequence. And also the magnitude of such negative consequence will be how much? I mean, how many people will it affect? Similarly, what is the susceptibility to a particular hazard or a threat that the consumers or the people who consume this particular food would potentially have? And risk and its outcomes can be estimated. They always think, experts are always of the opinion, the risks, yeah, you have heard in the previous talks that both the experts were saying, risk can be estimated. But, no risk cannot be guaranteed. And Dr. Sudarshan had already said that there is no zero risk food available anywhere. It is only the extent of that particular risk which is likely to pose a harm to the consumer. That is, but this is the perspective of an expert or a scientist. But we are all consumers in our own right. We are, or whether we are scientists or whether or not we are scientists, whether we are students of food technology or nutrition or whatever, we are consumers in our own right. When you are consumers in your own right, we are all confronted with these questions. Like, it all depends on the risk. There are sometimes we fear the risk, whether or not it is actually a risk to us or not. See, the best example is the fear that people carried about the packed food delivery at home during the COVID times. I mean, now during the pandemic times, there are a lot of people, and then there are a lot of people, friends of mine, who call up and ask me how to wash the vegetables. There were a couple of them who also started washing vegetables in sanitizers and detergents, because that's the dread that people carry. Whether it is true or not, an expert would not believe in that kind of thing. An expert would suggest what the experts have been suggesting for quite a long time, even during the COVID time, is that you get vegetable or fruit and wash it thoroughly under running water, and things like that, not beyond that. But consumer wouldn't perceive it like that. And how much they perceive is known about the risk. Sometimes the consumers are not aware, and then they also think, their perception is shaped by what they know about the potential risk. So that's very important. High dread plus unknown is equal to increased attention by media. Yeah, I'll come to this, because it's largely sometimes the media that shapes the perception of risk among us. So the more people dread a particular thing, the more lack of knowledge they have. The media actually heightens the particular risk perception. It is called social amplification function of media. Media also socially amplifies a particular risk, and also others. We all are people who operate media in our own right. We are all broadcasters with the availability of our mobile phone devices and the number of social media platforms that we are all active in, and the kind of message sharing platforms that we are active in. We are also disseminating messages sometimes, mostly because we do not know, and we dread a particular risk. So there is a slight difference in what is hazard and risk. We have already seen what is a hazard and what is a risk. I don't want to go into the details again, but most importantly, we need to understand what we need to understand is the perception of risk, the judgment that people make about characteristics, likelihood, and severity of a specific risk upon consumption of a particular food. So this is very important for the uptake of any risk-related communication that you would do to the people. And media and food risks information is very, very important, because media are the principal sources of food risk information for many consumers. Media are very crucial sources, and they can steer public opinion on safety or healthfulness of certain foods. Highly publicized food safety events affect consumer perceptions. I'll tell you how in the subsequent slides of a study that Dr. Sudarshan and I got done through a student. And the highly publicized food safety events affect consumer perceptions and sometimes even their purchasing patterns. The sudden accessibility of knowledge sometimes turns a food hazard into a perceived risk. So there is a hazard, but that hazard need not necessarily be a risk for the people. But if there is a sudden attention to particular knowledge, which was hitherto unknown to the people, suddenly you get to know a new thing about a particular food, then it starts worrying you. It shapes your risk perception. Eventually, that risk perception with bombardment of information becomes a scare. So, risk perception, this is a simple flow. Risk perceptions are the person's views about the risk inherent in a particular situation. Sometimes people may not have any view about a particular food safety, but exposure to heightened media coverage about a hazard, whether or not it is a risk to the person, gets socially amplified because people start talking about it. What a scholar called Kasperson has called it social amplification of risk. And eventually it turns out to be a scare related to food safety. So this is a study that I was referring to, wherein we try to in 2016, in the period of 2016, I think we tried to assess what were the highest seen food-related safety issues by people on media and how they shaped their food safety related perception. Why I'm saying this is perception is very important for risk communication. So we've gone to Google Trends, and then we've assessed what are the most frequently seen read or highly covered food related scares in the media. Of course, at that time we had the issue of Maggie and glutamate and lead in noodles. That was the one that got a lot of attention in media and also a lot of traction among the readers. Similarly, we have artificial ripening, which comes every year and mostly during summers when mangoes are ripened artificially. And then pesticide residues in fruit and vegetable were the next ones. And there were reports of milk being the most adulterated product, which often gets reported in the media again. And there were also hormonal injections to vegetables and cattle. Now, giving these hormonal injections like oxytocin and other things. And also, you have seen those videos wherein people would show a particular a person injecting a particular chemical into a watermelon. Next day, it becomes so big that it cannot even go into the refrigerator. So, I mean, this kind of media reports have happened during that time, and these are some of the examples of the media portrayals. And the issues were totally different. What we did this.
I think there should be some audio problem.
Now, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now. Yeah.
Can you?
Yes,
yeah,
yes.
Sorry, there is a power outage. There is a power outage. Then our.
Please go ahead, please. Dr. SubbaRao? Yeah, I think there seems to be internet outage with Dr. SubbaRao. We'll wait for a moment. In the meanwhile, when Dr. SubbaRao is going to come back, Dr. Sudarshan? Dr. Sudarshan? Dr. Lewis? Dr. Lewis? If anybody has any questions now.
Okay, I can hear you.
Oh, you're back. Okay. You can share this. Yeah, Dr. Lewis, Dr. SubbaRao have, I think, got logged out for some internet issues, maybe. Dr. Sudarshan, yeah. If anybody has any specific questions, they can pertaining to Dr. Lewis or Dr. Sudarshan's talk. Dr. SubbaRao is back.
I'm sorry. There's a lot of issue with our net connectivity.
No problem.
I've shifted to my mobile phone T3. Okay.
You want me to put the slides?
No,
your slide is not here with me. Oh, okay.
I'm okay with this.
Okay.
Yeah, did I finish with this slide when the power went off? Or
yeah, I think you were still through. Yeah, it's you.
Yeah. Okay. I'll just repeat again that we were in this study. What we tried to do is we tried to assess the perception of risk of the consumer and also who's exposed to these particular heightened media coverage, which is not essentially risk communication but hazard related communication, and how it differed from what the scientists perceived as risks. As I showed in one of my earlier slides, there is a lot of difference between what consumers perceive as risks, which, I mean, it need not necessarily match with the actual risks, actual risks that are listed by the experts. The experts perceive risks based on the analysis, based on the assessment, and then they come up with a management procedure for those risks. But heightened awareness about or new knowledge about the hazard can actually trigger an amount of risk perception which is not commensurate with the actual risk. So this is one of the things. You've seen how the Maggie controversy has erupted and how it has affected the entire thing. And then uh, initially it was monosodium glutamate, then it was about lead, it was about various things, and then a lot of these went off the shelves and other things. A lot of things have happened. Similarly, there were stories about pesticides and then chemicals in the foods that we usually consume and their excessive usage, and people were of the opinion that all the fruit and vegetable we are eating are laden with these pesticides and chemicals, and then we are ultimately eating only poison. And then every glass of milk that you had, everybody thought was really contaminated. And then, of course, these things you've seen, people thought the red pomegranates had always had some chemical injected in them, or the deeper the color of watermelon inside, people thought that so much of color was injected into it. These are all unfounded. You see, the kind of media portrayals also. If you see this particular thing, you can see it talks about artificial ripening of. It's a story. I mean, it's a news story on artificial ripening of mangoes. This guy is sleeping on the mangoes. Actually, he's tired or something like that. But the headline says the killer, the silent killer. It gives a perception that this person has eaten mangoes and died over the heap of mangoes. So it's like it's so much. It's talked about so much. Of course, the issue related to calcium carbide and the court cases related to that, it's all known, it's banned, it's not used. But nevertheless, artificial ripening itself is accepted as per but the perception that people have in mind is that if any fruit is artificially ripened, see, the climacteric fruits can ripen on their own even after they are. So if you wait for every fruit to be ripened on the tree and then pluck it and then give it to the consumer, is it virtually possible? People don't think like that. Because of these stories, people perceive that that there is a lot of risk in everything that is artificially ripened, and then artificial ripening, the process itself is not acceptable to most of the consumers. So yeah, what has happened with these kind of stories that we've seen on media, so there are two distinct differences that the consumers found. They knew, I mean, they thought they were exposed to news items related to food risk on fruit and vegetable. I mean, the pesticide risk on fruit and vegetable, artificial ripening of foods, and other things. But people have made a distinct difference between, uh, uh, you know, regularly consumed foods or essential kind of foods, and the foods that they thought were bought for taste and for luxury. So Maggie fell in the second category. So 77% of the people who were consuming Maggie before the controversy stopped consuming it. But later, once it was relaunched, 49% of the respondents in our study said they resumed consuming Maggie. But all these respondents had stopped consuming earlier. But no change was seen when it came to the food. So what they thought is, I mean, as I said, even if they perceive that there is a risk from a particular food, if there is no alternative to that food, people may not change their habit. So when, as a risk communicator, when you're talking to the people, when you talk about the risks, are there any alternatives that also need to be talked about is the question. So, as I said, necessary foods plus convenience foods. Perception of why risk perception changes among people from time to time. That is because it stems mostly from uncertainty. Why I say uncertainty? Because science itself is very dynamic, it keeps changing. When the scientific knowledge is dynamic and it changing, the kind of communication that the risk managers make to the people are very dynamic. They keep changing. For instance, you take the example of COVID. The kind of uh, science that has changed about usage of a face mask itself. Initially, they said the mask can be worn only by need to be worn only by the health workers who are working in close proximity of the patients. But later they said it is for everyone. Then they said it is a N95 is not required for all, but something else is required. Then they said it's a two-layer mask. So as and when the science, similarly, it happens with the food also. So the kind of perception that is once established has to change depending on the dynamic nature of the scientific knowledge that actually keeps changing from time to time with newer addition of research. So what people perceive after all this is experts do understand that there is inherent uncertainty, or experts do understand that the newer methods of analysis have come. Experts do understand that the limits that you set for various things can change based on the newer understanding of science. But consumers don't think this. Consumers may be of the opinion that we scientists are actually changing their minds from time to time, or media is confusing or overdoing or reacting more to a particular situation. They are sometimes worried as to whom to believe. So in this case, we are very clear that an understanding of perception of risk is very, very essential. And why that perception of risk is essential is because we need to see how much it is aligning with the actual risk about which you as a risk communicator is trying to propagate or are trying to propagate. So understanding and perception are very important. When you go to understanding and perception of consumer, you need to understand that they are guided by many factors, including their level of education and their level of nutrition and food safety literacy. How much do they know about these concepts and the social norms and the traditions that they follow? What is the perception of self? Although there is a risk to many people, for instance, driving on a road without a helmet poses equal risk to many people driving on the same road. But there could be people who perceive that they are immune to this, or people may think, it doesn't happen to me, an accident may not happen to me. But that person's perception of risk is very low. Whereas there could be a person who makes it a point to wear a helmet because that person realizes that there is a possibility of an accident happening to me. The risk of accident is very high. So at the same time, that perception of self is very, very important. How one perceives, whether one perceives one to be susceptible to the risk or not, also is important. I'll come to that particular risk perception analysis framework in my next slide. So, and this perception of risk is also influenced by many people around us. So all these need to be studied for an effective risk communication to happen. Otherwise, if the communication or risk communication becomes very ineffective, then what happens is it leaves people confused with insufficient or inaccurate information to make a food choice, and it can lead to people feeling confused and angry, and sometimes may think the authorities or the regulators are not doing their bit to ensure food safety. That's what is the usual experience that I get whenever I talk about food labeling. People expect the authorities or the regulators or the implementers to take care of everything. As Dr. Sudarshan said in one of his slides, providing information on food label is also a sort of risk communication. You're trying to tell them what are the risks involved in it. Like, if there is an allergen, if there is a particular kind of a food is not suitable for certain people, all the declaration is there on that. But if that is not taken by the people, then they may be confused. In the worst case, the consequences of poor communication can be an increased number of people affected by hazard. So, if you are not communicating well, that also can happen. This is a slide, very important slide. There is a researcher called Peter Sandman, who has done tremendous amount of work on risk communication, both in health and climate change and many other areas as well. And what Peter Sandman says about risk communication is that there are hazards and there is an outrage about hazards. He says risk is equal to hazard plus outrage. The amount of hazard and the kind of outrage prompts your issue for immediate risk communication. So if there is a more and more outrage, whether it is media outrage or public outrage about a particular thing, that becomes unknowingly your issue for risk communication. So in risk communication, at the same time, you also have to resort to precaution advocacy, which is like telling them what could be the potential risk. It's like preemptive. It is like preparing people so that they don't fall prey to the risk. But this is crisis communication. Often there is crisis, the Maggie kind of thing. I'm sure Maggie's, advertisers or Maggie's media management people would have actually gone into so much of crisis communication during the crisis that it has faced some time back. Similarly, there is outrage management. So these are all part of risk communication. Sometimes you have to manage the outrage. Sometimes you have to manage the crisis. But most often you have to do advocacy related to precaution. What are the various things that happen in each of these? If you say the precaution advocacy, if you're talking about the potential risk and trying to make people aware of those potential risks, you know that there is a very high hazard, but people are not yet talking about it. There is no outreach. So in that situation, it is easy to tell them about the possible hazard. Similarly, in a situation where there is a crisis, what happens is there is a high hazard and there is also high outreach. And then there is an issue where the outrage, where there is low hazard. Actually, there is no hazard at all. But people are talking too much about it, thinking that it could cause a potential harm to them. So in this case, what needs to be done is the extent of outrage needs to be reduced by giving confidence to the people about the particular food in question. So in doing so, what should be done? What do we consider as communicators? If you want to be a good risk communicator, what do you need to consider? Understanding the nature of the food safety issue and understanding the nature of the food. Sorry, there is a repetition of this. Understanding the nature of the food safety issue is very important. What is the food safety issue? How many people does it affect? And what kind of foods are involved in this? And where these kinds of foods are being sold or consumed or are taken. Understanding the target audience. Who would be a target audience? I'm giving this in the perspective of the consumers alone. But sometimes if you understand a food safety issue and then you need to talk to the manager or a risk analyst, then perhaps you should understand who your target audience is. Sometimes it's the consumers, sometimes it's the risk managers, sometimes the politicians, sometimes it's the media or anybody that is involved. So what is the history of this risk and the political and media environments in which we have to manage this particular risk through communication? We need to have a clear understanding of this and understand the communicator's responsibilities for food safety risk communication. So as a communicator, you have certain responsibility, whether you are trying to mitigate an outrage, whether you are trying to mitigate a hazard, whether you are trying to create preemptive communication about possible risk. What is your role as a communicator? You need to understand. Then implementing, once you have a risk communication in place, how do you implement this risk communication? I'm sure you need to understand the purpose. By knowing your audience, now you know the audience, whether it is a risk manager, whether it is a risk analyst, whether it is a policy maker, or whether it is the consumer. Who is your audience, and who will be your primary and secondary and tertiary audience? So if you find about a particular food safety risk, there could be a regulator who needs to take management policy about how to manage that particular risk among people, and you need to create that kind of awareness among people who influence the consumer maybe the industry, the marketers, and other things. So all these should be part of your risk communication package, and then don't try to change everything at one go. So key risk messages you need to understand. There could be many potential risks for the people, but the amount of exposure to a particular hazard and the probability of that hazard turning out to be harmful to the people could be lesser for certain things. So they become your issues, not for immediate consideration. I'll come to that with an example in the next case study. And a stakeholder interactions are very, very important. Who would be your stakeholders? Everybody could be your stakeholder. As Dr. Sudarshan has already said, it's the risk managers, it's the risk management, the risk analysts, everybody, the politicians, the regulators, the implementers, everybody. I mean, regulation and implementation are part of management itself. And then dealing with uncertainty, you should be able to deal with the uncertainty of risk perception, uncertainty of the perceived uncertainty because of the changing scientific information, and accordingly develop message which is appropriate for the time, and choose your media and channels accordingly. But most important thing in this communication is to monitor and evaluate. As I said, it's not a one-off affair. You have to keep going back to this communication to see whether you've done the right job or not. So again, coming back to the risk perception analysis framework, how would a person's risk be considered for risk communication? There are four broad scenarios that we can consider. There is a term called self-efficacy that I've used here. Self-efficacy is nothing but the perception of an individual that he or she can do what is being suggested to do to mitigate the risk. I hope I'm very clear. See, you perhaps suggest that somebody is, say, let's take an example of weight management. May not be a good example for food safety, but that's what is coming to my mind. You suggest somebody to take a physical activity, follow physical activity regimen, say for about 40 minutes or 1 hour every day, so that weight can be managed. But if the person thinks that I cannot take out that 1 hour of time every day, or it's a very difficult proposition for me to do it, or thinks that there are reasons why I can't do this physical activity, the person's self-efficacy is very low. I mean, it's a very crude example, but self-efficacy is nothing but a person's perception of or the perceived ability to do the thing that a risk manager is trying to, risk communicator is trying to tell you. So in this, if you take, there are four broad scenarios wherein there is a high risk perception. The people think, on consuming this food, I have a very high risk, but they think I can't do anything about it. That's the first scenario. In this scenario, risk communication should aim at increasing the self-efficacy perception of the people. There is no point in telling about the risk, because the person already knows the risk. The person is already feeling threatened with the risk, but the person is not thinking that he or she can do anything about it. So what is to be done is to be communicated in this scenario. When you come to the next scenario, the perception of risk itself is low. People may think, the helmet example that I gave. So I nothing will happen to me. At the same time, I can't do it. If that is the scenario, you have to increase both the perception of the risk. The perception of the risk in that case can be improved with the help of a right message. The right message can be, because why is the person thinking that nothing would happen to him if he doesn't wear a helmet while driving? Because the person thinks he drives very well. So the kind of messaging that is required here is that a road accident can take place not just because of your fault. Even if the other person who's driving on the road is at fault, it could be risky to you. So the framing of the message is very important to enhance the perception of risk, and then the self-efficacy should also be enhanced. And there is another scenario where there is a low risk perception. I think nothing will happen to me upon consuming a particular food, but the regulator or the risk manager thinks these foods, consuming at a particular level could pose a health hazard to me. In that case, I think nothing is going to happen to me, but I'm willing to do whatever somebody tells me to do for my better health. So in this case, the risk needs to be drilled into the mind of the person, saying that what is the risk, where is it emanating from, and with what amount of food in what frequency would cause that particular risk. Finally, the best scenario for good and effective risk communication is that people are pursuing that they are actually at a high risk, and they are also willing to do whatever you tell them. So if you, all communication should drive at getting these two in place, so that the risk communication becomes extremely effective, and the response efficacy is what uh, uh, the outcome that the person would get upon following the advice that the risk communicator is giving. So I will now end with this small case study wherein we would tell you about the food safety risks at the household level in home kitchens, how food safety can be compromised because of various risks, and people may not perceive them as risks at all. So this case study is from a research study that Dr. and I were collaborators in. And I say risk communication is one such area which needs multidisciplinary collaboration. It cannot be done only by managers, regulators, or analysts, or the people engaged in risk assessment. It is a multidisciplinary thing. Yeah, I mean, this is what we all know after a lot of, this is among the food safety related risk communication packages of WHO. If you see their classic book on food safety risk communication, you will definitely see this as one of the key things. But our proposition was little different. Since most people in India consume food largely at home, are these very relevant to Indian context or not? So from there we started, and these 5 keys for food safety, although in their own way may be applicable to Indian context, but may need some amount of tinkering based on the real hazards and real risks that are there in home kitchens. So when we saw refrigerators, we know refrigerators are not the temperatures related thing doesn't. For instance, if you take this particular message says anything could be unsafe after 2 hours. Cooked food can be unsafe after 2 hours. But no Indian would take this message seriously, because the perception of risk is very low, because everyone would say what is prepared at our home is usually consumed in the evenings also. Is this applicable? Because the perception, until unless you create that perception of risk, people may not take your message seriously. So is this relevant in Indian context as a risk at all or not, is one thing. And then also this is a study on water. People feel that water being consumed from probably the taps and other things is safe, but some in some places people do consume that, they think that they are unsafe to it is unsafe to drink water from the taps and other things. So what they do is they try and get these the bottled water cans, 20-liter cans. In one of our studies, one of our students, Gagana, what she's done is she's actually done an observation study in rural areas, because the samples of water that was picked up from households were contaminated, and they had some microbial presence in them, which was not desirable in terms of safety. But we were not clear as to what could be our point of risk communication in this. Should we tell people not to get water? Should we tell people to change the source of water? So in that case, what has been done is, through observation, what has been understood is the way that water can is being handled at household level was observed continuously in many households. What was seen is, when they are actually emptying the can into their pails or maybe into their vessels, the hand of the person is getting, water is getting in touch with the hand. At the same time, when water is being taken out of a pail, also the hand is getting in contact with the water. That's where the water is getting contaminated. So is it, in risk communication, is it nice to say the water itself is contaminated, or what is contaminating your water? I think the second one is better. So our message was framed accordingly. I'll show you in the subsequent slide. Yeah, I mean, this is one of the articles from earlier studies that we've done. And then we saw that at household level, why the 5 keys of food safety are not so much applicable to Indian context, because there are a lot of things that happen in the home kitchens which could compromise the safety of our foods. And they are very contextual. These matters are not, something that are applicable around the globe. There could be context specific issues, and we argued that this needs to be looked into. So this is yet another study in which the food safety index was developed by Dr. Sudarshan's lab. What has been done is the food safety index was developed by understanding what are the various risk practices that are happening in home kitchens, and vis-a-vis associating them with the microbial load in the food samples picked up and drinking water samples picked up from the point of use. As I said in the earlier slide, the water was getting contaminated at the point of use. So hand rinses were taken, cooked food samples were taken, and drinking water were taken. They were analyzed for indicator microbes, and then these were associated with 87 different food items which had knowledge, food safety related knowledge, which had food safety related practices, all included there in there, along with certain factors what we call as enabling environment, like cooking gas supply, like water supply, like a separate kitchen, like because all these do have an impact on the food safety risk. So to communicate what exactly are the risks and how these risks can can compromise the safety of food at household level, what we had done is these 87 different items vis-a-vis the microbial contamination in the food were associated, and it was found that 11 items, of which mostly were related to knowledge and practices, and 2 were related to the enabling environment, that is separate kitchen and water, piped water supply. So these 11 items had direct association with the risks of the microbial load in the foods. So these 11 items were taken as important aspects for food safety risk communication at the household level. So the score was developed by giving weightages to these. And what we've seen is of the 11 items, certain weightage was given to each of these items, some on knowledge, some on enabling environment, and some on the assets, and some on the practices. And in that, what we've seen is 17 was the maximum possible score. If any household got 9 or above, their house was food safe. So we've developed a package to align with this particular understanding of food safety risks. So this is what I said, 11 items, and these were the 5 critical issues. So these 11 items could be again categorized into 5 critical issues. So the 5 keys of food safety that the WHO is talking about are a little different from the 5 keys of food safety which are compromising the safety, which could likely compromise the safety of foods at household level. So these 5 were poor hand hygiene. But that is a very broad message to give, hand hygiene. But what exactly in hand hygiene? Is it washing the hand? Is it trimming the nail? Is it anything else that needs to be talked about? And cross contamination. What in cross contamination are you talking about? Is it cross contamination in the refrigerator? Is it cross contamination of cooked and raw foods? Is it veg and non-veg foods? Or using the ladle of one food into the other? What is it that is causing cross contamination? And poor quality of water, drinking water, and then improper maintenance of domestic kitchen. What in improper maintenance of domestic kitchen? Is it about cleanliness of the kitchen? Is it about pets? Is it about rodents? Is it about insects? What about it? And improper washing of fruit and vegetable. These were the 5 broad areas, but within them, we've again pinpointed the key messages that need to be given, which should also enhance the risk perception, at the same time self-efficacy of the individual. An individual to whom you're targeting should feel that these are doable without much involvement of resources. So these were the simple messages that were drawn out of these critical issues, and these messages in turn were categorized into simple, doable messages to enhance the self-efficacy perception of the people. And this is the final 5 key messages that we've got. Clean hands properly. You would again ask me, sir, it's the same message which is vague. But if you turn the hand backwards, it would have the key messages that one needs to follow. And this is what it is. See, clean hands properly. And what in Indian context is very important is trimming nails, washing with soap under running water. These two, if they are practiced, largely the food safety risks can be addressed. Similarly, keep your home kitchen clean. This is a very vague message. But what in the home kitchen is very important? Keep pests and pets away, because we've seen that presence of pets in the kitchen area had direct relationship with the food safety. And keep the kitchen surfaces clean. In a lot of homes where surfaces were not clean, the foods were contaminated. So these are the key messages, and this is how risk communication needs to be done. We didn't want to change everything at the household level, because within each of these broad areas there could be 100 things which are probably putting the food at risk. But what are those which are most likely to put food at risk are the ones which need to be targeted. And this is how risk communication needs to be done. This is just one of the practical examples that I have shown, but it depends on the context of the food that you're consuming. Since this appeal to most of the people, and as I said, we are all consumers again, it appeals to most of us. So that's the reason why I took the consumer perspective in making you understand about risk communication. But this needs to be followed with every target group that you are trying to do. And thank you very much. I think I stuck to the time, and then I'll leave it open for discussion now. Dr. Shetty?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. SubbaRao. And now we have touched 5 o'clock. Therefore, we will have maybe 10 minutes of discussion from the people who are here. Now, any of the participants who would like to ask questions can unmute themselves and ask. All the 3 speakers are here. Now the communication problem starts. Anybody? Any of the participants would like to ask any questions? Dr. SubbaRao, I'll ask a question to you first.
Please.
Just as a starting point, for others to get encouraged to ask questions. Now, in terms of communication, there are 2 things. One is, how do you make people, who are not very well versed with, technical things about food, to get not too scared or not to get carried away by messages which just float on the surface, especially the WhatsApp as a medium today.
Yeah, I keep including this particular part in all my presentations, but today, in the interest of time, I've removed this because
maybe you can put that.
So as responsible people, if you know anything, the first thing that we should need to do is, as people who use the chatting platforms or the social media platforms, please don't share any message which is not authentic, whose source you do not know. If you know the source and the source authenticity is ensured, then you can share it. And as a food safety person or a food technology person, if you know that the particular message that is being shared is wrong, you please take the pain of writing down to the people saying that this is fake, this is not true, and what is the scientific rationale behind your review is to be told to the people. This is very important. But of course, we cannot stop all the information that happens in terms of miscommunication or maybe fake news spreading.
Thank you, Dr. Because I also, sometimes one of the techniques I use is that whenever I get anything related to food and food safety, I give an answer and ask them to send it backwards.
Yes.
At least I can reach a few people backwards.
Yes, that's what I too do. Otherwise, I bother Dr. Sudarshan most of the times. If I am not clear about a safety issue, I ask him, and then I make it a point to type and send it to the people, and then say, please send it to the source from where you received it.
Yes, correct.
Yeah, Dr. Sudarshan may want to add something. I don't know.
Sudarshan, please.
No, it's fine. No.
Dr. Sudarshan, you want to add something?
No, that's very important. What is it? Because many times now in the pandemic, now what we are seeing is on WHO. They are actually putting WHO because people will believe whatever WHO says is right.
Yeah.
They'll put that and put whatever they want to write and
Make it to believe.
Yeah, and many things like that have surfaced in the name of ICMR also. But we made it a point to even give out in the media saying that this is a fake news that is being circulated, and we put it out on our Twitter and other handles also.
Yes. Dr. Lewis? Dr. Lewis?
Yeah.
Yeah. I have a question. I have a question for you. Or you want to add anything on this?
No, I don't have anything to add per se, but I'm just wondering, in that I think one of the things that we need to contend with is that agreed there is a lot of misinformation out there. It's free, it's available freely, it comes to your desk, it comes to your phone, it accesses you. You don't have to access that information.
Yes.
It just drops in whether you like it or not.
Yes.
And often it drops in because your own friend circle puts it there. So maybe even the family circle puts it there. So it's difficult. But there is one point that I was wondering. I'm not making a point, but I'm just wondering. This pandemic, has revealed one issue actually. And very often in the earlier days, I used to watch the CNN because you could see an epidemiologist, the Dr. Tony Fauci, and on the other hand, you had a president there with all the power behind him. And you could see actually a great play of science versus misinformation. There was all the time they were talking about, we will open up tomorrow, we will open up next week, this is a passing thing. And this man very clearly said, it will be the virus who will decide when we can open up. But the point really, because many of us are scientists here or come from scientific institutions. So my question really is there a place for science? Science may be uncertain, but it corrects itself. That is the good thing about science. As new information comes in, it corrects itself. Misinformation does not correct itself. So, scientists like I know even I run to Dr. Sudarshan when I have a question on anything related to safety. But is there a way that one can communicate risk in a more simple and scientific manner? I have this feeling, I think this program you had is very nice, but I have this feeling we have to make science simple for the consumer. Typically we are also, it's like doctors. If you try to read their prescription, you will never know what disease you have. So, but if the doctor were to explain to you in a simple manner what you have, you'll go home and say, why am I going to a doctor if I know I just have a common cold? My grandmother will give me the right medicine and cure me. So this is the tussle. We have a lot of traditional faith in our own families and our own knowledge. But I don't know whether it's time for us to see that science becomes a little bit more assertive, maybe I could put it, in communicating. That's the only thing I have to say.
Thank you, Dr. Louis, because I think I will also, if you take home the information, one of the information what Dr. SubbaRao has said, it is overplaying of certain, risk factor makes people, one is to believe it. Second, also that they get really scared of things, and they don't. Okay, I don't want to eat chicken because there is hormone in that. I don't want to eat a vegetable because pesticide in that. Then, if but there is no those informations or those this thing. They don't give any solution of what to do.
That is correct.
Scare and leave it.
Yes.
There are a lot of studies in media studies which show that there is a natural liking for negative news, even for the journalists who cover and for the readers who read, or even for us. A negative news would catch our attention more than a positive news. If you say, this food is very good for Health, you would only just want to see the picture, which one are they talking about, and then leave it at that. But if somebody said, this is very harmful to consume, you would want to read it. So that's where the actual risk of a particular food, even when it is explained well by the people or the scientists, is shown to be something that is negative or potentially negative to the people and is highlighted as and that's when it gets converted into a scare. That's an issue with this. So that's the reason why it is always necessary to have parallel media platforms. Now that you can run your own broadcast media yourself, it is much more wiser to have a communication team constantly working for the scientists and then giving out the true risk related. And that's what in the pandemic time, if you see, WHO or FSSA have done repeatedly for everything that has been circulating in terms of, more or less everything that has been circulating in terms of misinformation was countered by their infographics, and then those two got equally circulated. Like all the scare about non-vegetarian foods carrying virus immediately had some answer from WHO or FSSA, and immediately they came into public domain as well. So that's where, that's why I said it has to be a dynamic process. It cannot be a once-off affair that, you identify risk, tell people about this and keep quiet about it. No, a lot of communication needs to happen amongst the managers, amongst the, analysts, and amongst the regulators and implementers as well.
Now, why I brought this point is that because this platform is basically the students, and, because they should better start analyzing these things, and start thinking about it. And it is nice that we have done this today, and we have also clarified certain of those aspects, either in terms of the concept of hazards, concept of risk, and also how to manage. And at the end, I intentionally wanted to bring this point so that this is also part of the risk communication. Risk communication is not by the government. Risk communication need not be by any specific person. It is actually the intellectual, people who are involved in the food. If all of them become proper risk communicators, risk miscommunicators can be handled in the right way.
Yeah, that's a good take-home message, and that's the reason why if you see any risk communication definition talks about exchange information between the stakeholders. Who are the stakeholders? Everyone is a stakeholder. Consumer is a stakeholder, manufacturer is a stakeholder, you are a stakeholder, I am a stakeholder. Everyone is a stakeholder in risk communication.
Thank you. Any specific questions from any of the participants? Because now, okay, if there is no specific questions, I think I would like to wind up. Before winding up, to the information of all the participants, we'll be sending the link for feedback before 7 o'clock today, and you have time till tomorrow evening to respond to it. And whoever wishes to get the e-certificates, you can mention in the Google form so that it will be sent to you. And I would like to place on record my sincere thanks to all the three eminent speakers of today's webinar for discussing these issues threadbare. That is what was the concept with which me and Dr. Louis started this webinar. And what we wanted to have is not to have 10 or 20 minutes, 10 or 15 minutes where people rush up with their ideas. We wanted to have ample time so that we will be able to discuss the issues threadbare. And we have we wanted to have a dedicated session on risk and safety, so that we can make these matter clear, and people can start thinking. Because anyway, it's only a spark for people to start thinking. And this video is available on the YouTube link what we have sent. People can go back and see, understand again, so that any clarification they want, they can always come back and see. And they can also share this link with other people, so that more and more people can get benefited from that. And anyway, coming back again, I would like to thank Dr. Louis, Dr. Sudarshan, and Dr. SubbaRao for taking their time and spending their entire half day with us in this venture. Thank you very much to all three of you. And I would like to also thank all the participants for participating in both Google Meet as well as in the YouTube live streaming. And last but not the least, most importantly, I would like to thank our computer section, Mr. Balan, who is with me here. for helping me with the technical aspects here, and our university for giving a platform for me to do this webinar. Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.